The entire emergency department erupted in applause when security dragged Nurse Mara Voss out through the sliding glass doors of Hargrove Regional Medical Center. Someone actually whistled. Dr. Elliot Marsh stood at the nurse's station with his arms crossed, watching her go, looking like a man who'd just won something. Mara didn't cry, didn't argue. She handed over her badge without a word and walked into the cold Oregon morning, carrying nothing but her jacket and the quiet certainty that she'd made the right call. 22 minutes later, 4 black SUVs with federal plates screamed into the parking lot, and a man built like a concrete wall in civilian clothes stormed through the front doors and said 7 words that changed everything. "We need Mara Voss. Where is she?" If you're new here, follow this channel so you don't miss how this story ends. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Hargrove Regional Medical Center sat at the edge of Dunmore, Oregon, the kind of mid-sized city that never made national news and preferred it that way. The hospital was 11 stories of glass and concrete wedged between a commercial strip and a neighborhood of old Douglas firs, and it ran the way most regional hospitals ran, on tight budgets, institutional pride, and an unspoken hierarchy that everyone understood and nobody questioned out loud. The ER on the ground floor processed somewhere between 100 and 140 patients on a busy day. The staff knew each other's coffee orders and each other's bad habits. The rhythms were predictable in the way hospital rhythms become predictable when nothing catastrophic has happened in a while. Mara Voss had worked the night shift in that ER for 3 years. She was 38, medium height, with dark circles she'd stopped trying to conceal, and a habit of arriving 7 minutes before her shift started to review the board before anyone briefed her. She moved quietly through the department, not timidly, just efficiently, the way someone moves when they've learned to conserve energy over long halls and across distances that have nothing to do with hospital corridors. The other nurses liked her well enough, though most of them had filed her somewhere in their minds under reliable but unremarkable. She didn't volunteer opinions in team huddles. She didn't go to after-shift drinks at the bar on Clement Street where half the ER staff unwound on Friday nights. She brought her own lunch in a black insulated bag, ate it in the break room in about 12 minutes, and went back to work. The residents thought she was slow, not incompetent, just methodical in a way that read, to people in a hurry, as hesitation. Dr. Elliot Marsh, head of trauma and emergency services at Hargrove Regional, had formed his opinion of her sometime in her first month. He'd watched her handle a moderate laceration case with careful, measured movements, and decided she was the kind of nurse who was adequate for the role and unlikely to distinguish herself beyond it. He'd never substantially revised that view. In 3 years, she'd given him no dramatic reason to. She'd made sure of it. Thursday evening, mid-November, started the way most Thursday evenings started. The department had the usual early shift rhythm. 2 chest pain workups waiting for cardiology callbacks, a 12-year-old with a broken wrist from soccer practice who was handling it better than his father, a woman in her mid-70s with a kidney infection that had been sitting untreated for 4 days because she hadn't wanted to bother anyone. Mara was managing the far bay, IVs, reassessments, charting, when the radio crackled from the ambulance bay. She heard the paramedic's voice come through and felt something shift in her without knowing precisely why. The words were standard. Male patient, mid-50s, ground-level fall at home. But there was something in the medic's cadence, a flatness that wasn't calm, the particular register of someone maintaining composure over a situation that's quietly slipping. She put down her chart and moved toward the bay. The gurney came through 60 seconds later. Jerome Fleck, 54 years old, accountant, husband, grandfather of 2. According to the medic's report, he'd been found at the bottom of his back porch steps by his wife, who'd been calling him in for dinner. The wife was convinced it was a fall. The medics were less sure. Mara looked at him before anyone said another word. His color was wrong, a grayish undertone beneath the pallor, the kind that doesn't come from a simple fall. His eyes were open but tracking slowly, like the signal between brain and body was running through something thick. He was breathing, but the breaths were shallow and slightly labored in a way that wasn't consistent with musculoskeletal pain from a tumble-down 3 porch steps. Dr. Cullen, the second-year resident covering the bay, stepped in with the intake clipboard and started running through the report with the paramedic. "Pressure's been dropping since we picked him up," the medic said. 80/50 on scene, 68/40 en route. We pushed fluids, but it's not responding. Any loss of consciousness? Wife says he was responsive when she found him. He's been in and out since. Cullen nodded, made a note, and started calling out orders. Standard trauma workup, IV access, cardiac monitor, chest x-ray, 12-lead ECG. By the book. Appropriate. Exactly what the protocol called for. Mara moved to the bedside while the team set up around her. She put her hand on Fleck's forearm. The skin was cool and damp, and leaned in close enough that he could focus on her face without effort. "Mr. Fleck, I'm Mara. Can you hear me?" His eyes moved to her slowly. He got about half a syllable out before it dissolved. "Don't try to talk. Just blink twice if you understand me." 2 blinks. She straightened and did a quick visual sweep. His neck veins were distended, visibly, significantly, in a way that wasn't subtle. She positioned her stethoscope and listened to his chest, and what she heard in the left field made her go still for a moment. Breath sounds diminished, not absent. Diminished. The muffled quality of sound moving through something that shouldn't be there. She pulled the stethoscope back and looked at the monitor. Heart rate climbing. Pressure still dropping despite the fluid the medics had pushed. The tracing on the monitor had a quality to it she recognized from context that had nothing to do with this hospital. She looked at Cullen. "I want to flag something." He was writing. "Yeah, go ahead." Diminished breath sounds on the left. JVD is significant. His pressure is still dropping despite fluids, and he's been symptomatic with chest complaints for 2 days, according to the wife. She kept her voice neutral, informational. "I think we should rule out pericardial tamponade before we move to CT." Cullen glanced at her over the clipboard. "He fell. The fall might be secondary. If his pressure's been dipping for 2 days, we'll get a formal echo when the tech comes available. Right now, I want the chest film and the 12-lead. He said it pleasantly enough, the way residents say things to nurses when they want to acknowledge the comment without engaging with it. Mara nodded and went back to her task. She sent a text to the charge nurse asking if the portable ultrasound was free and if it could be wheeled to Bay 4. She worded it as a logistical question, not a clinical request, because she understood the difference between a door that opens and a wall you push against and get nothing for. She documented her assessment findings in the chart with precise, time-stamped language. She watched the monitor. The rate jumped again. 11 beats in 90 seconds. Marsh came in while Cullen was reviewing the preliminary results. The two of them stood together at the monitor cart and talked in the low, abbreviated register of attending in resident, the shorthand of people who don't need to fully explain themselves to each other. Mara worked around them and listened without appearing to. Marsh looked at the X-ray image on the portable viewer. He looked at the patient. He looked at the 12-lead. He said something to Cullen about bilateral chest involvement consistent with impact mechanics, about fluid management and CT sequencing. His voice had the particular confidence of a man who's been right enough times that being wrong has started to seem unlikely to him. The portable ultrasound had arrived in the bay by then. It was sitting 6 feet from Jerome Fleck's left side. "Dr. Marsh?" He turned. Mara kept her posture neutral and her hands at her sides. "The echo is right here. It would take under 5 minutes. His pressure is 65/38 right now, and it's been dropping continuously since admission. If there's a tamponade, I understand the clinical picture, Voss. Then you know I've ordered the CT." The pleasant professional veneer in his voice dropped about half a degree. Not all the way. Just enough to let her know the conversation was over. "The imaging will give us what we need to move forward. Get back to your assigned tasks." She stood there. He held her gaze with the flat patience of a man waiting for a subordinate to comply. She walked to the ultrasound machine, powered it on, and moved to the patient's bedside. The room didn't go loud. It went quiet. The particular quiet of people deciding very quickly whether to look or look away, of a situation tipping from professional disagreement into something with harder edges. "Voss?" Marsh's voice landed like a door closing. "He's going to arrest in the next 2 to 3 minutes without intervention." She said it the way she'd said things in places where there was no time for tone and no space for softening. She said it as a fact she had already checked twice. She positioned the probe below the xiphoid and angled up, and the image came on screen in seconds. A bright halo of fluid surrounding the heart. Circumferential. Dense. The kind of image that, Once you've seen it enough times, you cannot talk yourself out of seeing. The resident went still. Get pericardiocentesis set up, Mara said to the tech. Now please. Stop. Marsh stepped forward. You do not have standing to order. His pressure is 51/22, the monitor tech said. Her voice was very thin. The room broke toward movement in the way rooms do when the clinical reality outpaces the argument. The tech was already moving for the kit. Cullen stepped to the bedside. Marsh stood in the center of the bay, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man recalibrating medically. It was the expression of a man watching something slide out of his control, and the anger in it was entirely personal. Mara worked. She talked Cullen through the needle positioning with the ultrasound guiding, kept her voice even, instructional, giving him the steps in sequence the way someone delivers a protocol they've run so many times it lives in the hands and not the brain. She watched the angle, watched the screen, and when the needle tip appeared in the pericardial space and dark fluid began pulling back into the syringe, she exhaled through her nose and held the position. Flex pressure started climbing before they'd finished drawing the first 10 milliliters. 64, 71, 78/50. The rhythm on the monitor steadied. Fleck's eyes opened. Not the slow, lagging movement from before, but something more present, more alert. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the people around him. You're okay, Mara told him. Stay still. Don't reach for anything. You're okay. His mouth moved. What? Your heart had fluid around it. We just took care of it. You need to stay very still and let us finish. She put her hand on his arm again. Your wife is here. You're at Hargrove. You're going to be okay. He closed his eyes. His breathing was fuller now, better. Around her, the team finished what needed to be finished, drawing the pericardial fluid, labeling the sample, getting the secondary lines placed. The monitor beeped with a rhythm that no longer sounded like a warning. Marsh walked out of the bay without speaking. He waited until Fleck was stabilized and transferred to the cardiac intensive care unit. Then he sent a message to Mara through the charge nurse, not directly to her, which told her something, asking her to come to the trauma director's office when she was free. She finished her documentation first. Every detail, every timestamp, every clinical finding. She'd learned a long time ago that paper was the only thing that lasted. The trauma director's office had glass walls. Marsh hadn't closed the blinds. Cullen was there, standing near the window with his arms loosely crossed, looking at a point on the floor. Betsy Orville, the charge nurse who had worked this ER for 11 years, stood just inside the doorway with the still, careful posture of someone who has been told she is here as a witness and does not like what she is witnessing. Mara sat down. Marsh remained standing. He had a folder on the desk in front of him, a physical folder, paperwork already assembled, which told her this conversation had been constructed before tonight. Tonight had just been the occasion, not the origin. What you did this evening was a serious breach of clinical protocol and direct insubordination, he said. You overrode a treatment directive from the attending physician. You initiated a procedure you are not authorized to perform without physician order. You used equipment outside the scope of your ordered tasks. Mr. Fleck would have arrested within 2 minutes, she said. That is not a clinical judgment you are qualified or authorized to make. The echo showed data that a qualified physician would have identified through CT imaging on the timeline I ordered. He didn't raise his voice. Men like Marsh rarely needed to. The authority was structural, not vocal. You overstepped because you believe your instincts supersede the framework of this department. That is a dangerous belief in a nurse, and it's one I've had concerns about for some time. Betsy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I have a patient in the cardiac ICU, Mara said, who would not be alive right now under your timeline. You have a patient in the cardiac ICU because a physician team managed his care. He opened the folder and straightened a page. I'm recommending immediate termination, insubordination, and unauthorized clinical intervention. It's already being processed through HR. Betsy said, Elliot? It's done, Betsy. Mara looked at the folder. She looked at Marsh. She looked through the glass wall at the department beyond, where at least 4 members of the nursing staff had stopped what they were doing and were watching with faces arranged into professional neutrality. Is there anything else? She said. Marsh seemed to expect something more from her. Argument, maybe, or distress. He looked slightly wrong-footed by the question. Security will walk you out. She stood. She unclipped her badge from her scrub's pocket and set it on the corner of his desk, precisely, without emphasis. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. At the door, she stopped because he said her name. She turned. He looked at her with the particular satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he wanted and wants the other person to understand that fully. You don't have the temperament for this environment. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Jerome Fleck's eyes when his pressure climbed back up. She thought about his wife in the waiting room who didn't know yet that her husband was alive because of what happened in that bay 20 minutes ago. Take care of your patients, doctor, she said. She walked out. The two security guards fell into step behind her as she came out of the office, and the department noticed. Hospital departments always notice. The floor is its own closed ecosystem, and two guards trailing a nurse toward the exit is not a thing that goes unobserved. She walked the length of the department at the same pace she always walked it. She didn't look into the bays she passed. She didn't scan the faces watching her. She kept her eyes on the sliding glass doors at the end of the corridor and kept her breathing even and her posture straight and her hands loose at her sides. The applause started somewhere behind her left shoulder. One set of hands, then two or three more. Not a full department, maybe 6 or 7 people clustered near the nurses' station. The sound was layered. Some of it was mean, the kind of performative approval people offer when they think someone has been put in their place, and some of it was something harder to categorize, the sound of people doing something they know is complicated for reasons they haven't fully worked out yet. Someone whistled. Mara pushed through the glass doors. The cold hit her immediately. November in Dunmore came with a specific quality of damp, not just temperature but weight, the kind of air that gets into your jacket and stays. The parking lot was half empty, the overhead lights throwing flat orange pools on wet asphalt. She could see her car at the far end of the lot. An older Subaru, dark green, with a cracked left side mirror that she'd been meaning to replace since August. She stood still for a moment on the sidewalk in front of the entrance. She'd expected to feel wrecked. She'd braced for the particular crash that comes after the adrenaline clears, the hollow aftermath of a confrontation, the weight of having lost something. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complex than that. A kind of functional exhaustion, like finishing a long operation in difficult terrain and finally being able to acknowledge that your body has been working at maximum capacity for hours. She'd gotten him through. Jerome Fleck's wife was somewhere in the cardiac ICU waiting room right now, and she didn't know yet that the next few hours of her life were going to be different from what she'd feared when she found her husband at the bottom of those porch steps. That had happened. That was real and finished, and no paperwork or security escort or applause in the hallway changed it. She pulled on her jacket and started walking toward the Subaru. She was almost to the car when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, Oregon area code. She looked at it for a moment, then let it go to voicemail. She unlocked the car, got in, and sat in the cold interior while the heater slowly started working. The vents pushed air that was still cold, but she kept them on. Through the windshield, she watched the entrance to Hargrove Regional, the lit bays, the ambulance lane, the distant movement of people through glass. She'd spent 3 years learning to be invisible in that building, learning to compress herself into something that fit inside the shape of what they expected from her. And tonight the compression had failed because a man was going to die, and she was the only person in the room who understood exactly what was happening to him. She didn't regret it. She'd known she wouldn't. Her phone buzzed again. Same number. She answered. Voss? A pause on the other end. Not hesitation, but recalibration. The kind of pause that comes from someone trained to compress information into very small windows. She recognized the shape of it before she heard the voice. Male, clipped, efficient. This is Chief Warrant Officer Des Farrow. I need your 20. Her hand tightened on the phone. She hadn't heard that name in 4 years. Farrow. Yeah. No preamble, no pleasantries, ma'am. He never had done pleasantries. You're in Dunmore. You're at Hargrove. In the parking lot, she said. They just fired me. A half-second pause. We know. We need you anyway. She heard him exhale, not quite a sigh, more like someone venting pressure before continuing. Convoy carrying a federal witness got hit on Route 9 about 18 minutes ago. Multiple casualties inbound to your hospital. He paused again. and this time it wasn't tactical. "Mara, Weaver's on the convoy." The name arrived in her chest like something physical. Thomas Weaver, comms and signals specialist. 6th deployment when she'd last seen him. She'd spent 40 minutes with her hands inside his right shoulder in a forward position with a headlamp strapped to her forehead, working by feel as much as by sight, pulling shrapnel fragment by fragment while he stayed conscious because she told him to stay conscious, and he'd trusted her enough to do it. "How bad?" she said. "Bad." She was already reaching for the ignition. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. "We're at the entrance." She ended the call and held the phone in her hand and looked at Hargrove Regional through the windshield. The sliding glass doors, the lit ambulance bay, the department that had thrown her out 31 minutes ago. She thought about Marsh, about the folder on his desk, about the applause in the hallway. She put the car in reverse. The drive to the entrance took 40 seconds. She pulled into the ambulance lane and stopped. Before she'd gotten out of the car, she could see them. 3 men standing just outside the entrance in civilian clothes, jackets that didn't quite hide the way they carried themselves, the particular stillness of people who know how to wait in open space without looking like they're waiting. One of them stepped toward her as she got out. Des Farrow was 6'2", broad across the shoulders, with a jaw like a structural feature and close-cut dark hair that had more gray in it than she remembered. He looked at her for a moment the way people look at someone they know after a long gap, checking for changes, filing what's different. "You look like you just had a bad night," he said. "Getting better," she said. "Tell me about the convoy." 3 vehicles. Ambush on Route 9, mile marker 41, RPG and small arms. Drivers KIA. 2 protective detail agents with GSW, 1 critical. Primary witness has blast and fragmentation injuries, penetrating, locations complicated. He pulled the door open and held it. "Brooks, your trauma director." "Marsh," she said, walking through. "Marsh is trying to run the response, and he's already losing the room." Farrow let the door go behind them. "His team hasn't seen this category of injury outside a textbook, if that. The witness needs someone who's worked blast and penetrating in combination, and he needs it in the next—" He checked his watch. 9 minutes before the second rig arrives. Mara was already scanning the department as they walked in. The board was filling. She could see it from the entrance, names going up, status tags, room assignments getting shuffled by the charge nurse with the fixed efficiency of someone managing chaos rather than controlling it. The overhead fluorescents seemed brighter than they had 30 minutes ago, or maybe that was just the contrast with the parking lot dark. She could hear Marsh from 30 feet away. His voice was elevated, tight in the register that meant he was working hard to sound like the most confident person in the room. He was standing near the central trauma bay with his arms half out, directing traffic, and the people around him were moving, but not with the cohesion that comes from a team that trusts the plan. He hadn't seen her yet. A few nurses had. She'd watched their expressions change. Surprise, then something more guarded. The recalibration of people figuring out what it meant that she was back. She pulled a pair of gloves from the dispenser near the entrance and snapped them on. "Who else do you have?" she asked Farrow. 2 operators with field trauma cross-training. Not medics, but they've assisted enough times to be useful. He fell into step beside her. "Witness has a name. Raymond Volk, defense contractor. He's supposed to testify before a federal grand jury in 72 hours, which is why somebody tried to put him in the ground tonight." "I don't need the file right now," she said. "I need the injuries." Blast fragmentation to the right lateral chest and upper abdomen. 1 fragment may have nicked the liver, we're not sure. He was ambulatory immediately post-blast, which is either good or confusing. Probably both. She looked at the ambulance bay doors. "How far out?" Farrow checked his phone. 6 minutes. The department had noticed her by now in the collective, distributed way departments notice things. Heads turning, a murmur running through the nursing station, the subtle reorientation of attention. And then Marsh turned and his gaze landed on her, and the look on his face moved through several stages in about 2 seconds. Recognition, disbelief, and something that hardened quickly into authority. "Voss." He crossed the space between them in 8 steps. "You have been terminated from this hospital. You need to leave immediately." She looked at him. "You have federal protective detail agents and a material witness to a grand jury proceeding arriving in this department in approximately 6 minutes, with injuries your team is not equipped to manage." "My team?" Has never worked a blast and penetrating combo in a living patient, she said. It wasn't an argument. It was a statement of fact delivered without particular energy, the way she'd said things to people in roles above her when the facts were what mattered and the feelings attached to them were a separate problem. I have. That's why I'm here. Marsh's jaw tightened. He looked at Pharaoh. He looked at the other two operators standing near the entrance. He took in the civilian clothes and the way these men stood in a room, and she watched something in his face shift. Not capitulation, not quite, but the particular recalculation of a man who has encountered a situation that his usual tools don't fully fit. She is here as a consultant under my authorization, Pharaoh said. His voice was flat and entirely final. I'd suggest we use the next 5 minutes for prep. Marsh said nothing. Mara turned to the charge nurse, Betsy Orville, who had been watching this from near the station with a look on her face that was equal parts exhaustion and relief. Betsy, I need the secondary trauma bay opened, a full blast injury kit if you have it, or the closest equivalent, and someone to pull a second ultrasound. Tell them to set up for chest and abdominal. She paused. Please. Betsy was already moving. Mara turned toward the trauma bays. Outside, the first set of sirens reached the parking lot. The ambulance bay doors burst open, and the cold night air came in ahead of the gurney. And then the team was running, and Mara Voss was already at the head of it. The woman no one in this department had known was there. The one underneath the quiet and the dark circles and the careful contained movements stepped out of the way. What came forward in her place had been built in 12 years of places that looked nothing like this corridor, under conditions that had nothing to do with hospital protocol or departmental hierarchy or a trauma director's bruised ego. She looked at the patient on the gurney as they came through the doors. Raymond Volk was conscious. That was the first thing. The second thing was that he was bleeding from somewhere she couldn't see yet, and the clock on keeping him that way was already running. Talk to me, she said to the paramedic. And then she went to work. The paramedic's name was Dolan, and he talked fast. Raymond Volk, 61. Blast injury, right lateral chest and upper right abdomen. 2 fragments visible on external exam, at least one we can't see. GCS 14 on scene, 13 now. Pressure's been cycling. He'll hold at 90/60 and then drop and come back. SATs 89 on 15 liters. Right breath sounds are compromised. Mara was already at the gurney's right side, gloved hands moving across Volk's torso as they pushed him through the bay doors. She didn't look up while she worked. She was reading by touch. The geography of the injury, the tension of tissue under her fingers, the temperature differential between surfaces that should be uniform. Stop right there, she said, and the team stopped mid-corridor with the practiced immediacy of people who'd learned to respond to that register of voice. Don't move him again until I say. She put her stethoscope to his right chest. Absent breath sounds. Not diminished. Absent. She looked at the SAT monitor clipped to his finger. 87 and dropping. He's got a tension pneumo developing, she said. I need a 14-gauge angiocath, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line right side. Now. Dolan was already opening his kit. Behind her, she heard Marsh say something, the beginning of an objection, the word protocol somewhere in it, and Pharaoh's voice cutting across it with a single word, don't. There was a silence, and then there was no more objection. The needle went in. The hiss of released air was audible to everyone standing within 6 feet. Volk's oxygen saturation stopped dropping, held for 3 seconds at 87, and then began to climb. Slowly, not fast enough. He needs a chest tube, Mara said, already moving. Bay 2, let's go. They moved. Eek. Raymond Volk was not an easy patient. That was the thing about blast injuries that textbooks managed to underrepresent. They were never clean. A bullet wound was a line. A blast was a conversation between physics and biology that the body lost in multiple ways simultaneously, and the presentation was always a set of competing emergencies arguing for priority. His right lung was re-expanding with the chest tube in place, which handled the immediate oxygenation problem. His pressure was still cycling in a pattern she didn't love, not the steady decline of hemorrhagic shock, but the irregular dip in recovery that suggested something leaking that wasn't leaking fast enough to crash him outright. Something slow, intermittent, worse in some positions than others. She ordered the portable ultrasound and ran a fast exam herself while the nursing team secured his lines. Upper right quadrant, liver. She found what she was looking for and what she hadn't wanted to find at the same time. Free fluid in Morrison's pouch. A modest collection. But the liver surface had the irregular texture of something that had been disturbed rather than cleanly cut. Volk looked at her while she worked. He was conscious and cogent in the specific way trauma patients sometimes are. The mind sharper than it should be, given the circumstances, running on adrenaline and whatever training had been baked into him over years of work she didn't know the details of. His eyes were gray and red-rimmed, and they tracked her with an attention that wasn't passive. "How bad?" he said. "You're going to need surgery tonight. The good news is you're having this conversation." "What's the bad news?" "You need to stop talking so I can work." He almost smiled. Almost. She finished the fast, handed the probe to the tech, and stepped back to look at the board she'd built mentally in the last 8 minutes. Chest tube in, lung re-expanding, oxygen trending back toward acceptable. Liver injury present, but not yet catastrophically bleeding. A grade 2 or 3, her gut said, manageable if they got him to the OR without additional insult. Fragmentation still in situ in 2 locations, one in the lateral chest wall that was superficial enough to defer, one in the upper right abdomen that was close enough to the liver that she wanted a surgeon's eyes on it before anyone made a decision. She turned to find Dr. Cullen standing 4 feet behind her with the expression of someone watching a sport they'd never seen played before. "Where's your attending surgeon?" she said. "Dr. Raines is on call. She's been paged." "How long ago?" "About..." He checked his phone. "Says 6 minutes." "Page her again and tell her I need her in this bay in under 4 minutes. Or we're going to have a different conversation about the abdominal fragment." She looked at the nursing tech. "Get me a second large bore IV, left a C, and I need a type and cross if it hasn't been sent." "Sent from the field," Dolan said from the doorway, where he'd stayed to finish his paperwork and hadn't quite left. "Good." She looked at Volk's face again. His color was marginally better. His pressure had held at 88/58 for the last 90 seconds, which wasn't good but was at least consistent. "Raymond, still with me?" "Still here." His voice was rough. "The other 2, my detail. They're being worked in the next bay." She didn't know if that was true yet, but she knew Pharaoh's operators had followed the second gurney in, and she trusted that to mean something. "Your job is to stay focused on your own breathing right now. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Don't take any big breaths, small and controlled." "I know how to breathe." "Then do it better," she said, and turned back to the monitor. The second protective detail agent died before the surgical team arrived. His name was Marcus Priel, 44, 17 years with the U.S. Marshals Service. He'd taken 2 rounds in the initial ambush, one through the left thigh that had been managed with a tourniquet at the scene, and one to the right upper chest that the tourniquet couldn't do anything about. By the time the second rig brought him in, the chest wound had been bleeding internally for 38 minutes, and his pressure was 60/0 and falling. Marcia's team was in that bay. Mara heard it happening from 15 feet away. The elevated voices, the monitor alarms, the particular kind of urgency that's tinged with panic rather than focus. She heard Marsh calling for things in the wrong sequence, and she heard someone's voice crack slightly under the pressure of it, and she heard the monitor shift from alarming to the long, continuous tone that means everything is over. The bay went quiet. Then it went back to work, because there were still 2 other patients, and the work didn't pause for grief. She didn't look up from Volok. She stayed at the bedside, one hand on the rail, watching the monitor, because that was her patient, and he was still alive, and the distance between those 2 things was a gap she intended to keep as wide as possible. But she heard it, and something in her chest registered it in the way it always had. Not detachment, not numbness, but the specific grief of someone who has lost patients before and learned that you carry it and keep working because the alternative is 2 deaths instead of 1. Pharaoh appeared at her elbow 3 minutes later. "Priel's gone," he said quietly. "I know." "The first agent, Gutierrez, is in Bay 3. Looks like he's going to make it. GSW to the left shoulder, through and through, missed the subclavian. Okay?" She kept her eyes on the monitor. "Pharaoh, the fragment near Volk's liver. If Dr. Raines decides she wants to take him to the OR in the next hour, I need someone to make sure there's no interruption to that process. No administrative interference, no insurance hold, nothing. Already handled. She looked at him sideways. How? Volk is under federal protective jurisdiction. The moment he entered this facility, the hospital's administrative authority over his care became secondary to federal medical protocol. He said it the way he said most things, as a fact without drama. Marsh knows. He got the notification about 10 minutes ago. She almost said something and decided not to. She turned back to the monitor. Your surgical attending is coming in now, Farrow added. Dr. Rains, she was already in the building on another case. As if on cue, the bay doors swung open and Dr. Adrienne Rains walked in at a pace that said she'd been briefed en route and had opinions. She was compact, mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back and the kind of face that had settled into decisive lines over years of making calls under pressure. She went to the monitor first, the chart second, and Mara third. You're the one who placed the chest tube? Yes. And the fast shows, free fluid in Morrison's pouch, irregular liver surface, consistent with grade 2 or 3 laceration. Fragment is in the upper right quadrant, close to the anterior hepatic surface. I've been watching his pressure cycle every 4 to 6 minutes. Small drops, self-correcting, but the pattern suggests intermittent venous ooze from the liver edge. Rains looked at her for a moment, not a long moment, just enough to register something. You've seen this before? Yes. Where? Mara met her eyes briefly. Not here. Rains accepted that and moved to the bedside. She repeated the exam herself. Hands-on, efficient, not redundant, but thorough in the way surgeons are thorough, which is different from how nurses are thorough, and different again from how residents are thorough. When she straightened, her expression had the quality of a decision already made. We're going to the OR, she said. I want interventional radiology on standby in case I can manage the liver bleed without opening, but I want to be in there and able to convert if I have to. She looked at Mara. I want you in the room if you're available. I'm available, Mara said. Good. Rains was already talking to the nursing team about the OR prep. Her voice had the smooth, directive quality of someone who was used to being the most organized person in the room and saw no reason to apologize for it. Behind them, through the glass wall of the trauma bay, Mara could see the department continuing to function. Patients in beds, nurses moving between stations, the board getting updated, the quiet machinery of a hospital ER doing what it did. She could see Marsh near the nursing station, standing slightly apart from the staff around him, watching Bay 2 with an expression she didn't spend much time analyzing. She began preparing Volk for transport. The OR was on the 3rd floor, and in the time it took to move Volk from the trauma bay to the elevator and up, 3 things happened. The first was that Agent Gutierrez, the surviving protective detail agent from the convoy, asked to speak to Farrow from his bed in Bay 3. Farrow left with one of his operators. What passed between them, Mara didn't know yet, but she heard later from Betsy that Farrow's expression when he walked out of that bay was different from how it had been going in. The second was that Marsh called an administrative hold on the OR booking. It lasted 4 minutes. The federal notification that Farrow had referenced overrode it automatically, and the hold was removed before the elevator reached the 3rd floor. But Mara heard about it from Rain's scrub tech, who'd gotten the alert and then gotten the cancellation and was visibly irritated about both. The third thing was that one of Farrow's operators, a stocky, quiet man named Holt, whom she'd been introduced to in the parking lot by last name only, fell into step beside her as they wheeled Volk to the OR and said quietly, "We're getting chatter about a secondary team. Might be nothing." She looked at him. "Might not be," he added. She nodded once and went through the OR doors. Taut. The surgery took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Rains found the liver laceration on laparoscopic entry, a grade 3, the posterior segment, bleeding intermittently exactly the way Mara had described. She managed it with direct suture ligation and fibrin sealant, avoided the conversion to open, and had the liver stable within 40 minutes. The abdominal fragment came out cleanly. It had tracked along the surface of the liver without penetrating the parenchyma, which was the kind of luck that showed up in trauma cases exactly often enough to remind you not to count on it. The chest wall fragment required a separate small incision and came out in 2 pieces, which nobody had known until Rains was in there. Volk was closed and in recovery by 11:47. Mara stood in the scrub sink outside the OR and let the water run over her hands for longer than she needed to. Her feet hurt. Her lower back had the deep ache that came from standing on hard floors in clinical shoes for hours without sitting down. Her mouth was dry. She thought about Thomas Weaver, who she hadn't actually seen yet because he hadn't been on the convoy. Farrow had told her that in the parking lot, and she hadn't fully processed it in the time since. Weaver was somewhere else tonight, maybe sleeping, maybe working, maybe in a time zone where it was already tomorrow morning. The mention of his name had been enough to get her moving, which maybe said something about her and maybe said something about what those years had built between the people who'd lived through them. And either way, it didn't require examination right now. She turned off the water. Farrow was waiting in the corridor outside the scrub area. He had his phone in his hand and he was looking at something on it with a focused stillness that she recognized as the precursor to a problem. "Volk is stable," she said. "Rain's got the liver. He should be out of recovery and into ICU within the hour." "Good." He didn't look up immediately. "Gutierrez told me something." She waited. "He said the convoy was hit within 4 minutes of the route being called in over the Federal Communications Channel, which means the people who set up the ambush had access to federal comms." He put the phone in his jacket pocket and looked at her. The ambush wasn't opportunistic. Someone knew the exact route, the exact timing, and the exact vehicle formation. She processed that. Which means someone inside the federal structure, or with access to it. He exhaled. "Volk's testimony is 3 days out. Whoever arranged tonight isn't done." The corridor was quiet. The fluorescent hum overhead, the distant sound of the elevator, the muted PA from the floor below. "Holt mentioned a secondary team," she said. 20 minutes ago it was chatter." He checked his watch. "Now it's a confirmed intercept. 3-man team, credentials and weapons, entered Dunmore city limits approximately 40 minutes ago. We don't have a current position." She looked at him directly. "You think they're coming here?" Volk is the only surviving witness who was present at 4 separate contract signings. The other 2 witnesses are already in protective custody in separate facilities. He's the one who wasn't supposed to survive tonight. Farrow's voice was matter-of-fact, not alarming, in the way that very experienced people deliver alarming information. "If I'm running the operation to stop his testimony and my first attempt failed, I know where he is. I know which hospital. I know he just came out of surgery." Mara looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How many people do you have in the building?" she said. "Myself, Holt, and 2 others. Plus Gutierrez. But he's got 1 working arm right now." "And the hospital security?" 6 on shift, armed with the standard, which isn't much. She thought about the layout of the building. 11 floors, 2 main stairwells, 3 elevator banks, an ambulance bay entrance that opened directly to the ER, a loading dock on the east side of the building that half the staff used as an informal smokers area, and that, she happened to know, had a door lock that the facilities crew had been meaning to fix for 6 months. "The loading dock on the east side," she said. Farrow looked at her. "The door lock is broken, has been since September, and it opens into the service corridor that connects directly to the stairwell access for floors 2 through 7. She paused. "If someone wanted to reach the ICU from outside without coming through the main entrance, that's the route I'd take." He was already reaching for his phone. "No what?" Downstairs, in the emergency department, the night had not slowed down. The board had 5 active patients, 2 waiting on lab results, and 1 family in the consult room who'd been waiting for over an hour for news about a relative who had come in by ambulance with a cardiac event and ended up being managed on a different floor entirely. The kind of administrative confusion that happened in trauma surges and left people sitting in rooms alone, not knowing if the person they loved was alive. Betsy Orville had been on her feet for 9 hours. She'd been supposed to hand off at 10 o'clock, but the charge nurse coming on had called in sick, and the backup was delayed, and Betsy was still there at midnight doing 2 jobs with the specific quiet endurance of someone who understood that complaining about it was less efficient than simply continuing. She was updating the board when the first thing happened. The power in the east wing flickered, just once. A half-second dip, lights dropping and coming back, monitors blinking through the restart sequence, the ventilator in Bay 1 cycling through its alarm test before resetting. Nothing catastrophic. The kind of thing that happened occasionally in old hospital wiring, especially in wet weather. Betsy looked at the ceiling. The maintenance phone on the wall didn't ring. She went back to the board. 3 minutes later, the second thing happened. One of the security monitors at the nurses' station, a small screen that cycled through feeds from the parking lot cameras and the main entrance and the ambulance bay, went dark. Not the feed, not the channel, the monitor. Betsy looked at it. She looked at the nurse beside her, a young man named Curtis who'd been on shift for 6 hours and was currently on his third cup of coffee. He looked back at her. "That's never done that," he said. "No," she agreed. She picked up the desk phone and called the security desk at the main entrance. It rang 8 times. Nobody answered. Betsy stood very still for a moment. Then she reached for the overhead PA handset, thought better of it, put it down, and instead pulled out her personal cell phone and sent a text to Mara Voss's number that said simply, "Something's wrong down here." She hit send. 3 seconds later, the overhead lights in the entire emergency department went out. The backup generators kicked in after a 7-second delay, long enough for someone to scream in one of the far bays, long enough for the monitor alarms to all fire simultaneously in the dark, long enough for Betsy Orville to understand, in the specific way that people understand things they don't want to understand, that this was not a maintenance issue. The backup lighting was dimmer than the primary. It gave the department the quality of a room seen in a dream. Familiar shapes, wrong light, everything slightly off from where it should be. Curtis said very quietly, "Betsy." She looked where he was looking. Through the glass doors of the main entrance, visible in the low amber glow of the parking lot lights, 3 figures were moving toward the hospital entrance from the east side of the lot. They were moving quickly, close together, and they were not moving like people who just arrived at an emergency room looking for help. They were moving like people who knew exactly where they were going and had accounted for who might be in the way. Betsy grabbed the desk phone and called the number Farrow had given her 2 hours ago when he'd first come in with his operators and asked, very politely, if there was a contact number they could provide in case of emergencies. It rang once. "Tell me," he said. 3 people approaching the main entrance from the east parking lot. "Our security monitor is down. East wing power flickered about 4 minutes ago." She kept her voice low and even and was quietly proud of herself for doing it. "And I just lost visual on the security desk feed." A pause of about 1 second. "Get everyone away from the main entrance. Move patients toward the interior bays. Do not use the overhead PA." Another pause. "Where's Mara?" "3rd floor, I think. OR post-op. Tell her, use your cell." The line went dead. Betsy looked at the glass entrance doors. The 3 figures were 20 feet from the sliding glass panels now, and she could see enough in the parking lot light to see that one of them was carrying something long and dark along his right side that he wasn't trying very hard to conceal because he'd concluded, correctly, that the power outage would handle the camera problem and he didn't need to worry about the rest. She turned to Curtis. "Quietly," she said, "tell everyone to move toward the back. Patients, staff, everyone. Do it right now." Curtis was 26 and had been a nurse for 14 months, and his face in the backup lighting was pale and tight. But he nodded and he moved, and Betsy picked up her phone and started typing. Upstairs, on the 3rd floor corridor outside the OR recovery unit, Mara's phone buzzed in her scrubs pocket. She pulled it out and looked at Betsy's message, and then at Farrow, who was already on his own phone with Holt. His voice dropped to the register she recognized from a different time and a different context. Flat, clipped, information dense, the voice of someone shifting from prevention into response. She looked at the corridor around her. Post-op recovery to her left, elevator bank to her right, stairwell door at the end of the hall, 40 feet away. ICU entrance through the double doors 20 feet in the other direction, where Raymond Volk was being transferred right now, still sedated, still intubated, still technically alive because of everything that had happened in the last 3 hours. Farrow ended his call. He looked at her. She looked at him. "They're already inside, Shum," he said. The emergency stairwell door at the end of the corridor swung open. The man who came through the stairwell door first was not what Mara expected, and she'd learned a long time ago that the gap between expectation and reality in these moments was where people got killed. He was medium height, clean-shaven, wearing dark cargo pants and a gray zip jacket over what was clearly body armor. The slight rigidity across the chest, the way the jacket sat too high on the shoulders. He had a suppressed MP5 variant held low against his right thigh, muzzle down, finger indexed along the frame. You move the way people move when they've done this before and know that speed without control is just noise. He saw Pharaoh first. The half second that followed was the kind of half second that gets compressed in memory and expanded in the aftermath. Both men reading the space, the angles, the distances, running the same calculation from opposite sides. Pharaoh moved left and Mara moved right, without either of them saying a word about it. The suppressed weapon came up and Pharaoh was already not where it was aimed at, and the round went into the drywall above the nursing alcove at the end of the corridor with a sound like a staple gun rather than a gunshot. The second round went into the ceiling because Pharaoh had covered the distance in 2 steps and had the man's weapon arm controlled at the wrist. And the fight that followed was compact and brutal and lasted about 8 seconds before the operator was on the floor and the MP5 was in Pharaoh's hands. Mara had already moved through the double doors into the ICU corridor. She didn't look back. She knew what she'd heard. She knew the outcome from the absence of a third shot. And she had 6 seconds before whoever else had come in that stairwell understood what had happened to their point man. The ICU had 12 beds arranged in a horseshoe around the central nursing station. 8 of them occupied tonight. 3 nurses on shift. Raymond Volk in bed 7, still intubated, the ventilator cycling with the slow mechanical patience of a machine that didn't understand urgency. 2 ICU monitors alarming softly at the station because someone's central line had kinked during the transfer and nobody had gotten to it yet. The charge nurse, a tall woman in her late 40s named Petra Solis, looked up from the station when Mara came through the doors and read her face before she said a word. "Armed team in the building," Mara said, keeping her voice flat and low. 3 confirmed, possibly more. "They're on this floor. I need you to get every ambulatory patient and every staff member into the medication room and the supply corridor and lock both doors, right now." Petra stared at her for exactly 1 second. 1 second was all she allowed herself. Then she stood up and started moving and talking simultaneously, and Mara had a moment of clarity about what kind of person Petra Solis was. The kind who'd spent enough years in critical care to understand that the worst things were real and that the appropriate response to real things was motion. "Bed 3, 4, and 9 can walk," Petra said, already at the first bedside. "The others need transport or they stay. The ones who stay we position away from the windows and the door. Beds on the far wall." Mara moved to Volk's bedside. She looked at the vent settings, looked at his monitor, looked at the central line and the arterial line and the 3 drips hanging from the pole. He was deeply sedated, post-operative, entirely dependent on every line and tube and machine connected to him. Moving him wasn't an option. Leaving him was worse. She pulled the brake on his bed and repositioned it manually, pushing the whole assembly, vent, monitor, pole, drips, toward the far interior corner of the bay, away from the sight line of the door. It took effort, and it wasn't quiet, and the vent alarmed briefly when the circuit tugged, and she silenced the alarm and kept moving. "I need someone to stay with him," she said. "I'll stay," said a voice from behind her. She turned. One of the ICU nurses, young, maybe 25, with the wide-eyed look of someone processing something they hadn't trained for, had positioned himself next to Volk's bed. His name tag said R. Ames. His hands were steady, even if his face wasn't. "You know his drips?" she said. "I set them up. If the power goes fully out, the vent has a 20-minute internal battery. After that, you bag him manually, you understand?" He nodded. "If anyone comes through that door that isn't me or a man named Pharaoh, you get behind the bed and you stay down and you do not stop bagging him." She held his eyes for a moment. "He needs to be alive in 3 days to testify. That's the only thing that matters right now." Ames nodded again, and this time there was something behind it that was less about following instructions and more about deciding something. She recognized it. She turned and went back to the doors. Up. The corridor outside the ICU was empty. That was worse than if it hadn't been. Mara stood with her back against the wall beside the door and listened. The backup lighting gave the hallway its amber underwater quality and the normal sounds of the floor, the distant elevator mechanism, the PA from 2 floors below, the ambient hum of building systems, were all slightly wrong, either absent or altered in ways that told her the power situation wasn't stabilized and wasn't going to be. Her phone buzzed. Pharaoh. She read the text. "Second man down, third man unaccounted for." Holt reports 2 more entered through loading dock. Now 5 total. moving toward 3. 5. She did the math quickly. Farrow had herself, himself, Holt, and one other operator whose name she didn't know. Gutierrez was one floor below with one functioning arm. The hospital security staff, whatever was left of them after whatever had happened at the main entrance desk, were likely unaccounted for and possibly neutralized before the incursion reached the upper floors. 3 against 5, in a building full of patients who couldn't move. She typed back, "ICU secured, Volk in position. Where do you need me?" His response came in 11 seconds. "Stairwell B. They're trying to flank." She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the corridor. Stairwell B was at the south end of the 3rd floor, 80 feet from where she was standing, past the post-op recovery wing and the family consultation rooms. She'd worked this floor during a float rotation in her first year at Hargrove. She knew the layout the way you know things you've moved through repeatedly without thinking about them. Not as a floor plan, but as a sequence of spaces, distances, sight lines, doors that opened inward versus outward. She also knew that the medication room adjacent to the recovery wing had a pass-through window to the main corridor that the staff used for quick transfers, and that the lock on the pass-through had the same broken latch problem as the loading dock downstairs, because the same facilities crew had been handling both work orders since September. She moved, not running. Moving with the controlled pace that covered distance quickly, without the noise of urgency, weight forward on the balls of her feet, close to the wall, using the support pillars as she passed them. She'd done this in places with worse lighting and worse odds and no backup and no building knowledge, and she pushed the comparison away because comparison wasn't useful and the corridor in front of her was what was real. She reached the recovery wing junction. The pass-through window was to her left. The stairwell B door was 30 feet ahead. She heard voices, not words, just the low-coordinated murmur of people moving with a plan, from somewhere below and close, the sound traveling up the stairwell shaft. She stopped. She looked at the medication room door, which was closed but unlocked. She looked at the pass-through. She looked at the fire suppression panel on the wall between the 2 doors. A white metal box with a small glass window, the kind of panel that connected to the building's sprinkler system via a zone valve for this section of the floor. She thought about what happened when a fire suppression zone fired unexpectedly. Water, noise, alarm, visibility reduction. Every door in the affected zone triggering its fire protocol lock, which on this floor meant every room door auto-closed and the stairwell door sealed on a 15-second delay. 15 seconds was enough. She pulled the emergency cover off the zone panel, found the manual override valve, and looked at it for one moment. She thought about the post-op patients in the recovery wing. 3 of them, all in their own rooms, all post-surgical, all with wounds and lines and bandaging that water saturation was going to complicate in ways that weren't medically ideal. She thought about the 5 armed men in this building and what they were here to do. She pulled the valve. The sprinklers in this corridor outside stairwell B fired with a sound like heavy rain starting suddenly, and the alarm that followed was immediate and loud. Not the gentle chime of a smoke detector, but the full building alert, the kind that cut through walls and sedation and sleep. The stairwell door sealed with a solid clunk on its fire protocol, and from behind it she heard something that was either cursing or a communication. She couldn't tell which. She was already moving to the stairwell A at the north end of the floor because they'd be redirecting now, and she had maybe 90 seconds before they found the workaround. Farrow came out of stairwell A as she reached it. He was wet from somewhere. A cut above his left eyebrow had bled into his collar and dried there. And he had the MP5 in a low ready position and the particular expression of someone running a calculation that didn't have a clean solution. "That was you," he said, meaning the sprinklers. "Bought us a window." "Small one." He glanced back into the stairwell. "Holt has 2 of them contained on the 2nd floor landing. The other 2 redirected when the alarm fired. They split, one back toward the elevator bank, and one we've lost track of." "The lost one is the problem," she said. "Yeah." She heard the elevator arrive somewhere above them. The soft chime, the mechanical release of doors. 4th floor. She looked at the ceiling as if she could see through it. "The ICU is 3, she said. "If you went to 4 and works down." Farrow was already on his phone. She didn't wait for him to finish the call. She turned and went back toward the ICU at a run this time because the math had changed and 90 seconds had become 30, and the only thing on the fourth floor that connected directly to the third was the internal staircase used by the ICU staff for equipment transfers, the one that didn't appear on the public-facing floor maps. She'd used it twice during that float rotation. The door was at the far end of the ICU, past bed 12, behind a supply panel that looked like a wall if you didn't know what you were looking at. She came through the ICU doors and crossed the space at a speed that made Ames look up from Volk's bedside with alarm. "Stay down," she said, not breaking stride. She reached the supply panel and pulled it open. The internal staircase was narrow. Maintenance width, single file, metal steps. She took the first 3 stairs and stopped. Listened. Footsteps above. One person. Careful, deliberate, coming down. She pressed herself against the stairwell wall and waited, and this was the part that nobody who hadn't done this work understood. The waiting. The moment before contact when the body wants to do anything except hold still, when every instinct is motion and the discipline is the opposite of instinct. She'd learned it over years, and it had never gotten comfortable, and she didn't expect it to. The footsteps reached the landing above her. A pause. The door opened. The man who came through was the largest of the 3 she'd seen, heavy set across the shoulders with a close-cropped beard and the kind of controlled breathing that meant he was trying to move quietly and mostly succeeding. He had a suppressed pistol in a 2-hand grip, muzzle tracking the space ahead of him. He saw her at the same moment she moved. What followed was not clean. That was the honest truth of it, and the honest truth mattered because clean was a story people told afterward to make the facts sit better. She took a hit to her left shoulder from an elbow she didn't fully redirect in time, and the impact drove her into the metal railing hard enough that she felt it in her teeth, and the stairwell rang with the sound. She got his weapon hand controlled, but not immediately. It took 3 seconds of genuine struggle against someone who was bigger and knew what he was doing, and the pistol discharged once into the stairwell wall before she got the angle on his wrist that ended it. He went down. She stood over him breathing hard, her left shoulder sending complaints up into her neck and across her collarbone that she categorized as non-critical and filed for later. She secured the pistol and went back into the ICU. Ames was exactly where she'd told him to be, behind Volk's bed, one hand on the ventilator circuit, low, watching the door with the fixed attention of someone doing the one job they'd been given with everything they had. "He's okay," Ames said, meaning Volk. "Good." She put her back against the wall beside the door and breathed. "Stay there." Her phone. "Farrow. Holt has them. South stairwell. One unaccounted for, or, do you have him?" She typed, "Yes. ICU secure, Volk stable." A pause. Then, "Come to the 2nd floor. It's not over." The 2nd floor of Hargrove Regional housed the step-down unit, 2 procedure rooms, and the administrative wing, a cluster of offices and conference rooms that went dark and quiet after 6 in the evening on weekdays. The corridor connecting them was long and institutional, the kind of hallway that in normal light looked merely functional, and in backup lighting looked like something from a different kind of story. Mara took stairwell A down and found Farrow and Holt at the base of the south stairwell, with 2 men zip-tied and seated against the wall. One of them was conscious and cooperative in the particular way of someone who has decided that their options have narrowed beyond the point of resistance. The other was unconscious, a gash across his forehead from what looked like contact with the metal stair railing. Holt had a radio in his hand, not a hospital radio, but a compact tactical unit, black, encrypted, the kind you didn't buy at a consumer electronics store. He'd taken it from one of the men on the floor. "They're in communication with someone outside the building," Holt said. "I've been monitoring since we took the radio. Whoever's running this operation, they're not far." "How do you know?" Farrow said. "Signal latency. And the voice. Whoever it is isn't routing through a relay. They're talking direct." Mara looked at the 2 men on the floor. "This isn't a 5-man job," she said. "Not for a target in a hospital ICU with federal protective detail on site. 5 is too many for stealth and not enough for a real assault. This was a middle option. Enough people to push through a softened target, not enough to handle actual resistance." "Which means they expected less resistance," Farrow said. "Which means they expected us not to be here." She paused. Or they expected you to be handling something else. Farrow and Holt exchanged a look. The lobby, Holt said. What's in the lobby right now? Farrow's jaw set. 2 of my people, and about 30 civilian patients and family members who've been sheltering since the power went out. She was already moving toward the stairwell. The lobby of Hargrove Regional was 2 floors below ground level of the patient wings, technically the ground floor, with the ER adjacent and the main entrance facing the parking lot through a set of glass panels 20 feet wide. In normal operation, it was a throughway, populated with the particular mix of anxiety and boredom that characterizes hospital waiting areas at midnight. Tonight it had been filling since the power went out with people who'd come down from the upper floors on staff instruction, and people who'd been there already and hadn't known where else to go. Farrow's 2 operators, a woman named Teague and a man named Sorrells, had been managing the space, keeping people away from the glass, running security on the entrance. Mara learned this from Farrow in the 20 seconds it took them to descend 2 flights. What she learned in the next 10 seconds was that Teague had taken a round to the vest from a position outside the building, a shot through the glass entrance panel that had starred the panel without shattering it, which told her the weapon on the outside was a pistol at distance rather than a rifle up close. Teague was down on one knee, breathing, unhurt through the vest, but shaken and out of the immediate fight. Sorrells had taken cover behind the reception desk and was holding position. Mara came through the stairwell door into the lobby and took in the space in about 4 seconds. 31 people that she could count. Most of them behind the reception desk or in the corridor leading to the ER. 3 children, 1 in someone's arms. An elderly man in a wheelchair who'd been pushed into the corridor alcove by a staff member and was sitting with his hands folded with a patience that suggested he'd been through harder things than this. 2 nurses she recognized from the ER, both of them doing exactly what they should have been doing, which was keeping people low and quiet and away from the glass. One of the nurses caught her eye. Back ER entrance, the nurse said quietly. Someone's been testing it. Mara crossed to Teague. Where'd the shot come from? Teague pointed. Parking lot, east side, behind the 3rd row of cars. 1 shooter that I saw, maybe 2. They're not trying to breach, Mara said. They're trying to pin us down here while someone goes for Volk. The men in the stairwells were the diversion. The lobby was the diversion. The whole thing was designed to keep your people engaged on the ground floor while someone with real access went up. She looked at Farrow. The man I found in the ICU, he came from the 4th floor. He knew the internal staircase layout. That's not something you get from building diagrams. Farrow processed that. Inside help. Someone gave them a floor plan, maybe more than that. From outside, through the starred glass panel, Mara could see the parking lot and the flat light of the emergency exterior lamps, cars, wet asphalt, the distant tree line on the east boundary of the lot. She could see the shape of the 2nd and 3rd vehicle rows, and she could see, if she looked at the right angle, the faint signature of movement between 2 SUVs in the 3rd row. Not much. Just enough. She looked at the ER corridor behind her. She looked at the door at the end of it, the ambulance bay entrance, the one she'd walked out of 8 hours ago with security behind her, the one the parking lot shooter was positioned to watch. She thought about what Farrow had said. Signal latency. The person running this operation was close, not in the building but close to it, because they needed to be able to redirect in real time when the stairwell teams failed, when the power trick didn't clear the building the way they'd planned, when the secondary team through the loading dock ran into an operator named Holt, who was considerably harder to move through than anticipated. Close. In the lot, maybe. Or the tree line. I need the radio Holt took, she said. Farrow looked at her. They're still listening for check-ins. The stairwell teams haven't reported back because they can't. But whoever's outside doesn't know that yet. They're waiting. She held out her hand. He put the radio in it. She keyed the transmit and said nothing, just held the button for 2 seconds and released it. Static. Then, from the outside, a voice. Male, older, measured. The voice of someone accustomed to running things from a position of information advantage. Team 2, report. She said nothing, just keyed twice. 2 short bursts, the universal acknowledgement pattern she'd used in a dozen different contexts in a dozen different years. A pause. Confirm status on the primary. She keyed twice again. Another pause. Longer this time. The calculation on the other end, whether the irregular response pattern was communication trouble or something else. Move to extraction point. 2 minutes. She put the radio down and looked at Pharaoh. They're pulling out. Extraction point, somewhere near the lot. If we can get eyes on the exit route. Sorrels, Pharaoh said, and Sorrels was already moving without being told the rest. Mara went back to the lobby floor. She went to the nurse nearest her, a compact woman named Dara, who'd been with the ER for 5 years and who was currently crouched behind the reception desk holding the hand of a woman in her 60s who was shaking but controlled. "Are you good?" Mara said. "Been better," Dara said. "She's a patient. Came in 2 hours ago with a dislocated shoulder. It's reduced. She's got an ice pack. She's mostly just scared." "You're doing great," Mara told the woman with the shoulder. "Keep holding Dara's hand. 5 more minutes." The woman looked at her with wet eyes. "Are there people with guns in this hospital?" "Not for much longer," Mara said. She stood and went back to Pharaoh. Outside, through the starred glass, the parking lot had gone still. Not empty. Still. The particular stillness of people who have stopped moving because they've received an order rather than because the situation resolved. Sorrels was at the east corridor window with his phone, using the camera to extend his visual field around the corner of the building. He turned and held the phone toward Pharaoh. The image was grainy in the low light, but readable. 2 figures moving in a crouched walk-run along the east exterior wall, heading toward a dark-colored vehicle parked at the edge of the lot with its engine already running. And a third figure behind them, taller, moving with less urgency, the posture of someone directing rather than fleeing. "Can you get a face?" Pharaoh said. "Not at this distance and this light," Sorrel said. Mara looked at the image. She looked at the way the tall figure walked, the slight right-side lean, the way the left arm swung more than the right, an old compensation pattern so ingrained the person probably didn't know they were doing it. She knew that walk. She'd seen it in this building. Tonight. The certainty arrived in her chest like cold water, and she stood with it for a moment because she needed to be sure before she said it out loud. And the thing about certainty in high-pressure situations was that it could be the truest thing you'd ever felt, and it could be adrenaline talking, and the difference between those two things had real consequences. She looked at the walk again, the slight right-side lean, the left arm. She was sure. "Pharaoh," she said. "The man walking behind the 2 operators. I know who that is." He looked at her. "You're certain. Get a vehicle on the exit and don't lose them. And when this is over..." She stopped, reorganized, tried again. "When this is over, I need you to get me in front of whoever is running the federal investigation into Volk's case. Tonight, if possible." "Why?" "Because the person in that parking lot right now isn't one of the hired team," she said. "He works in this hospital, and if he knew enough to give them the internal staircase layout, he knows other things, things about the case, things about Volk." Pharaoh looked at the screen, looked at the walking figure, looked at Mara. "Who is it?" he said. She told him. The expression on his face moved through something she didn't have a name for. Not surprise exactly, but the reorganization that follows when a piece of information rearranges everything around it. He was on his phone before she'd finished the second syllable of the name. On the floor behind the reception desk, the woman with the dislocated shoulder had stopped shaking. Dara was talking to her in a low, even voice about something unrelated to any of this. Mara caught the words tomatoes and back garden. And the woman was listening and nodding, and the small ordinary warmth of it in the middle of everything else was almost hard to look at directly. Mara's left shoulder throbbed where she'd hit the railing. She'd need to assess it properly. Range of motion, point tenderness, possible anterior involvement, probably nothing structural, but she'd been wrong about that before and paid for it. She filed it again. Later. The dark vehicle in the parking lot was moving now. Slow, deliberate, toward the lot exit on the south side, headlights off. Sorrel said, "I've got a plate." Pharaoh relayed it into his phone. From 2 floors above, Mara's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Ames. Volk's pressure dropped. Woke up briefly. Pulled at the vent. He's down again, but something's... The message cut off. She was moving before she finished reading it. She hit the stairwell at a run, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her left shoulder pulling with each upward reach on the railing, and she came through the ICU doors to find Ames standing at Volk's bedside with both hands on the manual ventilation bag and the mechanical ventilator's alarms firing in sequence. Low pressure, high pressure, apnea alert, the overlapping cascade of a vent circuit that had been disrupted. She crossed to the bed. The ventilator circuit had been partially disconnected. Not the main connection, but the expiratory limb, the side that let air out. It looked like it had been caught on the bed rail during Volk's agitation and pulled loose, and Ames had moved to manual bagging immediately, which was exactly right, but the oxygenation had dipped during the transition, and the monitor was showing a SAT of 81 and dropping. "How long?" she said, reconnecting the circuit with hands that moved from muscle memory. "Maybe 90 seconds, Ames said, still bagging. "He moved. I don't know what triggered it." "Keep bagging. Don't stop until the vent takes over." She checked the circuit connection, checked the seal, looked at the vent display. The machine recognized the restored circuit and cycled through its restart sequence. 12 seconds. She counted them. At the end of the sequence, the vent began delivering breaths again, and she watched the SAT monitor. 81, 81-1, 82. She waited. 84, 86. Ames was still bagging. She put her hand on his arm and he stopped, looking at the vent with the expression of someone slowly releasing a breath they've been holding for 90 seconds. "He's back," she said. The monitor climbed to 92 and held. She stood at the bedside and looked at Raymond Volk's face. Sedated, intubated, post-operative, connected to 9 separate interventions keeping him in the window between alive and not. He was 61 years old and he'd survived a convoy ambush and 2 surgeries and an armed incursion and a ventilator disconnect in the span of 4 hours. He still needed to be alive in 71 hours. Behind her, the ICU door opened. She turned. It was Pharaoh. He stood in the doorway with his phone in his hand, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has just been told something that reframes what they thought they were dealing with. "The plate came back," he said. She waited. "The vehicle is registered to a shell company, one of 6 registered to the same parent entity." He paused. "The parent entity is a defense contractor, one of the contractors under investigation in Volk's testimony." She looked at him. "How many people in this hospital knew Volk was being brought here tonight?" As of the decision to route to Hargrove, 4 people inside the federal structure, 2 marshals, the convoy coordinator, and the hospital administrator who approved the federal patient protocol. And inside the hospital, once he arrived, Pharaoh's jaw worked. Whoever Marsh told. The name landed between them with the particular weight of something that had been forming in the background for hours and had just become impossible to avoid looking at directly. She thought about the administrative hold on the OR booking. 4 minutes of delay that could have killed Volk on the table if the federal override hadn't cleared it. She thought about the internal staircase layout and who in this building would know it as a matter of professional habit. She thought about the folder already assembled on Marsh's desk before she'd ever done anything tonight that technically justified termination. The folder that said this had been planned, that tonight had been the occasion rather than the cause, and she wondered now what occasion he'd been waiting for and why her specifically, and what her removal from this department was actually supposed to clear the way for. She looked at Pharaoh. "You need to find Marsh," she said. "Right now." Pharaoh was already on the phone. In the ICU, the monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and Volk breathed, and Ames stood at the bedside with his hands loose at his sides, and his face carrying the particular look of someone 25 years old who has just learned something about the world that they can't unlearn. From somewhere below, muffled through floors and walls, came the sound of a door slamming hard, then running footsteps, then silence. Pharaoh lowered his phone slowly. "Marsh is gone," he said. "His office is empty. Security card shows he badged out of the building 8 minutes ago." He looked at her. "Same time the vehicle left the parking lot." The silence after Pharaoh said it lasted about 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, Mara ran through every interaction she'd had with Elliot Marsh in 3 years and looked at them differently. The folder already assembled on his desk. The OR hold. The way he'd positioned himself in the trauma bay when she was working Volk, not managing the response, she understood now, but watching it, measuring it, calculating what she knew and how much of it was going to be a problem. Her termination hadn't been about Jerome Fleck. It had been about getting her out of the building before the convoy arrived. Someone had told Marsh the convoy was coming. Someone inside the federal structure had passed him the information, and he'd moved to clear the one person in his department with the training to recognize what a federal witness protection patient actually required. The one person who would have stayed at that bedside all night and noticed things that a civilian trauma team would walk past. She'd been removed 12 minutes before the convoy hit Route 9. The timing was not coincidental. "How far does he get on foot?" she said. "He didn't go on foot." Farrow pulled up something on his phone. Security card log shows he accessed the physician parking structure on the north side at 11:52. He has a vehicle. "You have the federal comms channel. Can you—" "Already running." He stepped into the corridor to talk, and she heard his voice drop into the clipped operational register, the one that moved information fast and didn't waste syllables on anything ambient. She stayed at Volk's bedside for a moment. The monitors were stable. The SAT was holding at 93. Ames had repositioned the ventilator circuit and was checking each connection with the methodical care of someone who didn't intend to have that happen again. "You did well tonight," she told him. He looked at her with the particular exhaustion of someone who had burned through more adrenaline in 3 hours than they normally processed in a month. "I didn't do anything except bag him. That was everything," she said. She went into the corridor. The FBI arrived at Hargrove Regional at 12:47 in the morning. Not the local field office, the Organized Crime and Public Corruption Division out of Portland, which told Mara that Farrow's calls had gone somewhere with specific jurisdiction and that whoever was on the other end had been waiting for exactly this kind of break. 4 agents in the first wave, 8 more in the second, 20 minutes later. They came in through the main entrance and the ambulance bay simultaneously, which was operationally redundant, but sent a message to anyone still in the building about the scope of what was happening. The lead agent was a woman named Daphne Okafor, 40-something, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of face that gave away nothing except precision. She found Mara in the corridor outside the ICU and shook her hand once, firmly, without preamble. "Your Voss," she said. "Yes." Farrow briefed me on the timeline. "I need your account of the internal staircase access, specifically the 4th-floor entry and the individual you encountered there." Mara gave it to her in sequence. Date, time, location, physical description of the individual, method of entry, outcome. No editorializing, just the facts in the order they happened. The way she'd been trained to report things in contexts where what you left out was as consequential as what you included. Okafor listened without interrupting. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both precise, both targeting details that would matter to chain of custody and federal court, and made notes on her phone. "The vehicle," she said. "Farrow's team has the plate and the last known direction, south on Dunmore Boulevard as of approximately 11:48. "We have it." Okafor looked toward the ICU doors. "The witness is stable? Post-operative, sedated, ventilated? Surgeon is Dr. Adrienne Rains. She's the one to talk to about his medical status. He should be extubatable in the next 6 to 12 hours if he stays stable. We need him coherent for testimony in 68 hours. "Talk to Rains," Mara said again. "That's her call, not mine." Okafor looked at her for a moment with the evaluating quality of someone filing information about a person rather than just what the person is telling them. "You were terminated from this hospital tonight, prior to the convoy arriving." "Yes." "And you came back anyway." "Someone I served with was mentioned, and then I was here and people needed help." She paused. "The termination is a separate issue." "It won't stay separate," Okafor said, and moved past her into the ICU. The hospital operated through the rest of that night on a kind of institutional autopilot. The combination of trained staff, established protocol, and the specific human capacity for continuing to function when the alternative is stopping, which helps no one. The ER downstairs had been cleared of non-emergency patients during the lockdown and was now filling again. The board repopulating with the ordinary catalog of overnight suffering that didn't pause for federal investigations. Betsy Orville was still there. Mara found her at the nurse's station at 1:15 in the morning, updating discharge paperwork with the mechanical focus of someone who has decided that doing the next task is the only available coping strategy. She looked up when Mara arrived at the desk. "Jerome Fleck's wife called," Betsy said. "From the cardiac ICU. She wanted to know if you were still in the building." Mara looked at her. "I told her I'd find out." Betsy's expression was careful in the way it had been careful all night. the look of someone holding a great deal more than they were saying. She wanted to thank you. She said the cardiologist told her if the tamponade had gone another 5 minutes without intervention. She stopped, started again. She cried for about 3 minutes on the phone. I just let her. Mara put both hands on the desk and looked at the board for a moment. Jerome Fleck's name was still on it in the transfer column, the notation showing his move to the cardiac ICU with Dr. Rain's cardiac surgery consult attached. How are you doing? Mara said. Betsy considered the question seriously, which was one of the things Mara had always respected about her. I'm going to go home in about 2 hours and not sleep and probably cry in my car, and then I'm going to come back tomorrow and do this again. She looked at the board. The usual. Sounds right, Mara said. You should get your shoulder looked at. Mara had forgotten she was carrying it differently. It's fine. You're holding it about 2 inches lower than the other one, and you've been doing it for 40 minutes, Betsy said, without particular emphasis. Bay 6 is open. Mara went to Bay 6. The shoulder was a moderate AC joint sprain. No separation, full range of motion preserved. But the ligament had been stressed enough that the next 3 days were going to be a sustained reminder of the stairwell railing. She wrapped it herself with supplies from the bay cabinet, took 2 ibuprofen from the medication dispenser with a documented self-administration note because habits were habits, and was sitting on the edge of the exam table writing the note when Dr. Cullen appeared in the bay doorway. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was accurate, and like he'd been thinking hard about something for several hours, which was also visible. I reviewed Mr. Fleck's chart, he said. The timeline. She waited. If you hadn't done what you did? He stopped, reorganized. I would have followed the CT plan. I believe Dr. Marsh's read. I had no reason not to. He looked at the floor for a moment. I'm not sure what that says about me. It says you were a second-year resident deferring to your attending, she said. That's what the system asks you to do. The system asked you to do the same thing. I've been around longer than the system expects me to have been, she said. It wasn't an explanation exactly, more like the closest she was going to get to one with the energy she had available at 1:30 in the morning. Cullen looked at her. What do I do with that? Learn what you saw tonight, file it. She pulled the wrap tighter with her free hand. The next time your attending calls a CT plan and something in the room doesn't fit, don't wait for permission to say it out loud. You don't have to override anyone, you just have to say the thing. He nodded slowly. Not the quick nod of someone acknowledging and moving on, but the slower kind that meant the words were going somewhere. He left without saying anything else, and that was fine. Elliot Marsh was arrested at 3:14 in the morning. He'd made it 47 miles south on I-5 before the state police unit running parallel to the federal intercept boxed his vehicle in at a rest stop outside a town called Galena Creek. He'd apparently been on the phone when they pulled him over. The phone was still unlocked when agents bagged it, which was the kind of operational mistake that happened when someone was running scared and thinking about their destination instead of their exposure. Okafor called Farrow with the arrest confirmation at 3:22. Farrow was in the hallway outside the ICU when he got the call, and he came to find Mara in the ER, where she'd gone back to work because Betsy was down a staff member, and the board needed coverage, and standing still had stopped being an option her body would accept. They have him, Farrow said. She was starting an IV on a patient, a man in his late 30s who'd come in with a migraine severe enough that he'd vomited twice in the waiting room and was now in Bay 4 looking like the light from the Bay monitor was a personal attack. She finished taping the IV and checked the drip before she turned around. What was on the phone? Early read from the agents on scene, communication records going back 14 months. He was in contact with a coordinator for one of the subsidiary companies under the defense contract umbrella. Money moved 3 times, offshore, routed back through a domestic account. The FBI's financial crimes team is being looped in now. She absorbed that. 14 months. Marsh had been in contact with the people behind the conspiracy for over a year, which meant that whatever his involvement was, it wasn't reactive. He hadn't been approached after Volk arrived, hadn't made a panicked decision in the chaos of tonight. He'd been positioned. He'd been an asset. He let people come into this building with weapons, she said. It came out flat because she was tired, and the flatness was the only register she had available for something that angry. With patients in the beds, Yes, Pharaoh said. There was nothing to add to it, so he didn't try. The 5 men who came in tonight. 3 in custody, 1 in surgical. He'll survive. The one you found in the ICU stairwell has a fractured wrist and a concussion. He's been processed and is being held under federal detention. He paused. The vehicle that left the lot, the 2 in it were picked up on Dunmore Boulevard 20 minutes after they left the hospital. The man in the back seat, who is running the operation externally, is a private security contractor. No military record, but he's been attached to 3 previous incidents connected to the defense contract under investigation. She looked at the Bay 4 patient, who had his eyes closed and was breathing carefully in a way that suggested the migraine medication was starting to work. She looked at the board. She looked at the clock on the wall. 3:27 in the morning. She had been in this building for, she did the math, 9 hours. She had been fired from it approximately 9 hours ago. What happens now? She said. Federally, Volk testifies. The investigation moves forward with the additional evidence from tonight. The contractor network is significantly more exposed than it was 24 hours ago. Pharaoh folded his arms. For the hospital, the administrator is going to have a very difficult morning. The board will be notified at 7 o'clock. Okafor's team will want access to administrative records going back 18 months to trace what Marsh knew when he knew it and whether anyone else in the administrative structure was involved. She looked at him. Do you think anyone else was? Honestly? No, I think Marsh was the node. I think he was recruited specifically because of his position, trauma director, credentialed access, administrative authority over the ER. One person in the right place is cleaner than 5 people who can talk to each other. He paused. But that's Okafor's determination, not mine. Bossum. At 5 in the morning, Raymond Volk was extubated. Rains made the call based on his blood gases and his responsiveness. He'd been lightening from the sedation on his own, fighting the tube in a way that was actually a good sign clinically, and she decided the risk of keeping him intubated outweighed the benefit. The extubation went smoothly, which was not always the case with post-surgical patients who'd been on the vent for several hours. And within 20 minutes, he was breathing on his own with supplemental oxygen via nasal cannula and looking at the ceiling of the ICU with the expression of someone reconstructing where they are and how they got there. Okafor was in the room within 5 minutes of being notified. Mara stayed outside. That wasn't her space anymore. The acute phase was done. The clinical picture was stable, and what happened in that room now belonged to federal jurisdiction and Rains' medical oversight. She stood in the corridor with a cup of coffee that someone had left at the nursing station and that she'd appropriated without apology. She heard Volk's voice through the closed door. She couldn't make out words, just register. The hoarse, effortful quality of someone who'd had a tube down their throat for hours and was talking anyway because they had things to say that couldn't wait. Ames came out of the ICU at 5:20. He'd been on shift for 12 hours and looked it. He stopped when he saw her. He asked about you, Ames said. Volk? He asked who the medic was who stabilized him in the ER. Rains told him it was a nurse. Ames paused. He said he wanted to talk to you before he testifies. She looked at the ICU door. He can talk to me when he's recovered enough that talking doesn't cost him anything. That's what I told him. Ames looked at his shoes for a moment. I've been in the ICU for 2 years. I've never had a night like this. Most people don't. Is this... He started and stopped. Is this what? Is this what it was like? Before? Wherever you were before this. She held the coffee cup with both hands. The question was direct and she gave it the respect of a direct answer. Some nights. Not all of them. The in-between was mostly logistics and waiting. She looked at the corridor. The nights like this stay with you differently than the others. He nodded. He went to clock out. But the hospital board convened an emergency meeting at 7:30 in the morning in the 4th floor conference room, which was directly above the ICU and directly below the floor where Hargrove Regional's administrative records were stored, a fact that 3 FBI agents were actively making use of when the board members arrived. Mara knew about the meeting because Betsy told her, and she knew what was on the agenda because Okafor's office had sent formal notification to the board chair at 6:45. Preliminary findings in the federal investigation, administrative review of Elliot Marsh's conduct and associations, and a mandatory review of all personnel decisions made under Marsh's authority in the preceding 18 months. All personnel decisions. Betsy said it plainly when she told her, "That includes yours." Mara said, "I know. You should be in that meeting." "I wasn't invited." "You should be anyway." She thought about it. She thought about walking into a room full of hospital administrators at 7:30 in the morning after being awake for 24 hours, with an ACE wrap on her shoulder and coffee she'd taken without asking, and a termination on her record that was now the subject of a federal review. She thought about what she'd say and what it would cost her to say it, and whether the cost was one she was prepared to pay in the specific state she was currently in. She went to the conference room. There were 9 board members and the interim administrator and 2 of Okafor's agents already seated when she came through the door. The board chair, a man in his mid-60s named Gerald Trout, who had the look of someone for whom this morning had fundamentally rearranged his understanding of his own institution, looked up when she entered. "Miss Voss," he said. "I wasn't formally invited," she said. "I'll leave if you'd prefer, but there are things this board needs to understand about last night, and I'm the most complete source you have available right now who isn't currently in federal custody." Trout looked at the 2 agents. One of them gave him a minimal nod that said this was not their decision to make. Trout looked back at Mara. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She laid out the night in the same way she'd laid it out for Okafor, sequentially, factually, without performance. Jerome Fleck first. The presentation, the clinical findings, the override, the outcome. Then the termination and the timing of it relative to the convoy ambush. Then Volk's arrival, the stabilization, the surgical decision, the armed incursion. She described what she'd done in the ICU stairwell in the same tone she used for everything else, because a different tone would have made it seem exceptional, and she needed the board to understand that it was operational, that it was a set of decisions made with available information and available resources, the same framework she'd applied to Jerome Fleck's pericardiocentesis, and to Volk's chest tube, and to every other intervention the night had required. When she finished, the room was quiet. Trout said, "The security footage." "I'm sorry?" "From last night, the FBI has requested access to all security footage from the building. They've been given it." He folded his hands on the table. "Our legal counsel reviewed the footage from the emergency department at approximately 9:15 last evening. The footage shows Dr. Marsh instructing security to escort you from the building and shows the department's response to that." He paused. "It also shows Mr. Fleck being transferred out of the trauma bay on a stable monitor approximately 4 minutes after you were escorted out, which the clinical record confirms was the direct result of the pericardiocentesis you performed." She waited. "The footage is going to be part of the federal evidentiary record," he said, "which means it will be publicly accessible through the court proceedings." Another pause. "The board is aware of what that footage shows, Ms. Voss. We're aware of how this institution is represented in it." She could feel the shape of where this was going, and she let it go there without helping it or hurrying it. "Dr. Marsh's employment is terminated effective immediately," Trout said. "The grounds are misconduct, breach of institutional trust, and conduct incompatible with the standards and mission of this hospital. The federal charges are a separate matter." He looked at her. "Your termination last night was executed under Dr. Marsh's authority, and on grounds that this board now has reason to believe were fabricated in order to serve purposes outside the scope of his administrative role." One of the other board members, a woman in her 50s whom Mara didn't know, said, "We'd like to formally rescind the termination." "Yes," Trout said, "with back pay for the period in question and a formal written apology from this institution." Mara looked at the table. She thought about what she wanted to say, and how much of it was going to land well, and how much of it was going to come out sharper than intended because she was tired and her shoulder hurt, and she'd been awake for 23 hours, and somewhere in the last 9 of them, she'd done things that were going to sit with her for a long time in ways she hadn't started processing yet. She said, "Jerome Fleck's wife wants to visit him today. Make sure there's no administrative barrier to that." Trout blinked. Yes, of course. "And I want a formal review of every patient outcome under Dr. Marsh's direct authority in the last 18 months. Not because I know there are problems, because I don't know that there aren't." A silence around the table, longer this time. That's a significant undertaking, the woman board member said. I know what it is, Mara said. The patients who came through this department in that period deserve to know their care wasn't influenced by whatever arrangement Marsh had outside this building. Another silence. Trout said, Agreed. She nodded. She looked at the two agents. Is there anything else you need from me this morning? Not right now, one of them said. We'll be in touch. She stood. Her knee popped when she did it, the sound embarrassingly loud in the quiet room, and she ignored it with the dignity of someone who was going to pretend that hadn't happened. She went back downstairs. Bess, the morning shift had started. The ER had the particular energy of a department in transition. Night staff handing off to day staff. The board still carrying the residue of the overnight, but filling now with the ordinary morning intake. The department working to reassert its normal rhythm, the way living systems do after disruption. They tend toward function. Mara sat in the break room with the second cup of coffee she'd had in the last 3 hours, and a granola bar she'd found in her locker from approximately 2 weeks ago. She ate half of it and then stopped because it tasted like cardboard, and she stopped pretending otherwise. Her phone had 17 messages. She'd read 3 of them. Her sister, twice. A number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a journalist. She deleted that one. And a voicemail from a number she did recognize, which she played twice and then sat with. Thomas Weaver's voice, unhurt, clear, calling from what sounded like an airport. Heard you had a night. Farrow briefed me. I want to say something, and I'm going to say it into a voicemail because you're better at accepting things when you don't have to respond in real time. What you did tonight, not just the medical stuff, the whole of it, that's who you've always been, Mara. The quiet version and the other version. They're the same person. Some of us knew that. Thought you should hear it from somebody. A pause. Get some sleep. She put the phone face down on the table. She finished the granola bar. Betsy came into the break room at 8:14 with the look of someone delivering information that is not entirely comfortable to deliver. She sat down across from Mara and put both hands flat on the table. The morning news cycle has picked it up, she said. Which part? All of it. Someone in the federal structure leaked the outline. The convoy ambush, the hospital incursion, the arrest. They don't have your name yet, but they have Marsh's. Betsy paused. The hospital's communications director is already in a meeting. The board chair issued a statement at 8 o'clock. Our phones have been forwarding media calls to an external line since 7:45. Mara considered that. When they get my name... When they get your name, this hospital is going to have to answer publicly for what happened in this department last night. All of it, including the footage that's now in the federal evidentiary record. Betsy looked at her directly. I want you to know that when that happens, every person on this floor who was here last night is going to tell the same story, because there's only one story to tell. Mara looked at the table, the granola bar wrapper, the coffee cup. She thought about the moment in the parking lot last night when she'd been sitting in the cold car deciding whether to answer Farrow's call. The 7 minutes she'd had where the worst day she'd expected to have was already finished and everything else was someone else's problem. She hadn't stayed in the car because of duty, or at least not only that. She'd stayed because Weaver's name had landed in her chest and moved something, and because there were people in this building who needed something she had and couldn't get anywhere else. And that calculation, the one between what something costs you and what it costs someone else if you don't do it, was one she'd been running since she was 26 years old in a place that looked nothing like Oregon. It wasn't clean. It didn't feel like resolution. It felt like the morning after something large, which was its own specific texture, exhaustion and clarity running in the same current. Her phone buzzed on the table. She turned it over. Okafor's number. She answered, Voss. Okafor's voice had the quality of someone who had also been awake all night and was now operating on institutional momentum. We've completed a preliminary review of Marsh's phone records. I need you to come to the 4th floor. Why? A pause, brief and precise. Because there's something in the records that involves you specifically, and you need to hear it before it becomes part of the public record. Mara stood. Give me 2 minutes, she said. She put on her jacket, carefully, accommodating the shoulder, and finished the coffee in 2 swallows and put the cup in the sink and went to the door. In the corridor outside, the day shift was moving, the board was updating, the department was doing what it did. A patient on a gurney was being wheeled past by a tech who nodded at her as he went. Two nurses at the station were talking in low voices about something that made one of them laugh. A short, surprise sound, the kind that happens when something is genuinely funny and the permission to find it funny catches you slightly off guard. She went to the elevator and pressed 4. Okafor was waiting in the corridor outside the administrative records room with a tablet in her hand and the expression of someone who had decided the most efficient approach was directness. She turned the tablet toward Mara without preamble. The screen showed a communication record, a message thread, formatted in the plain text of a recovered encrypted channel. Sender and recipient both identified by the forensic team's decryption work, names attached to metadata that the federal investigation had cross-referenced against personnel files. The sender was Marsh. The recipient was a name Mara didn't recognize, then a second name she didn't recognize, then a third message in the thread with a recipient she did. She read it twice. The date on the message was 11 months ago. The content was brief, the way things are brief when the people communicating understand each other well enough to compress. And what it said, in the specific shorthand of people coordinating something they did not want written in plain language, was that there was a problem in the ER. A nurse with a background that the sender had been trying to verify and couldn't. Someone who'd been asking, obliquely, about a patient case from 4 months prior that had closed in a way the sender wasn't comfortable with. The message said the problem needed to be managed before the pending case moved to indictment. The recipient, the third one, the name she recognized, had responded 4 days later. The response said, "Understood. Working on it." Mara lowered the tablet. She looked at Okafor. "The third recipient," she said. "You've confirmed the identity. Phone metadata, email cross-reference, and a financial record connecting the same account to 2 prior payments in the contractor network." Okafor's voice was level. "Yes." Mara put the tablet down on the records room table and stood with her hands at her sides. The name on the screen belonged to someone she'd trusted. Someone who had been in this building last night, who had known where she was and what she was doing, and who had, at multiple points, been in a position to pass that information to people who were trying to stop Raymond Volk from reaching a courtroom. Someone who had made sure Mara's personnel file had the specific notations that made her termination look procedurally clean. Someone who had been, from the beginning of last night, inside the response rather than outside it, close enough to observe, close enough to misdirect, close enough to ensure that if the primary operation failed, the secondary had the information it needed to adapt. The name on the screen was Betsy Orville. The name sat on the screen, and Mara stood there with it. She'd known Betsy Orville for 3 years. She'd eaten lunch 12 feet from her. She'd watched her manage the department with the kind of institutional competence that made everyone around her feel steadier. The consistent presence, the measured voice, the hand on the shoulder of a terrified family member in the consultation room. She'd thought, more than once, that Betsy was the actual spine of the ER regardless of who held the clinical titles. She had also, she now understood, been wrong about what Betsy was the spine of. Okafor was watching her. "When was she arrested?" Mara said. 40 minutes ago. She was still in the building. We waited until we had the full communication record confirmed before moving." Okafor took the tablet back. "She didn't run." "No," Mara said. "She wouldn't." That was the thing about Betsy that was going to be hardest to untangle later, in the quiet, when she had the time and the solitude to sit with it honestly. Betsy hadn't run because Betsy was not the kind of person who ran. And that quality, the steadiness, the capacity to remain in a situation and function through it, was something Mara had respected about her and was also, it turned out, what made her useful to people who needed someone embedded in a place over a long period of time. The traits that made her good at the job were the same traits that made her good at the other thing, and that was not comfortable to look at directly. "What was she getting?" Mara said. Okafor paused in the way of someone deciding how much to share. Financial records show 3 payments over 11 months, combined total $47,000, routed through 2 intermediary accounts. $47,000. Mara turned the number over. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't enough either, not for what it had cost, but that was a moral accounting that had no useful endpoint, and she left it alone. She passed them Volk's intake information, Okafor continued. Timing, room assignment, medical status after surgery. She was also the one who ensured the East Wing access door, the one with the broken lock, wasn't flagged for emergency repair before last night. The loading dock. September. The facilities crew. The work order that had never gotten done. Mara thought about Betsy telling her at 5 in the morning that she'd text her when the board meeting was over. She thought about the 2 agents in the conference room who'd given Trout the minimal nod when she walked in, and understood now that they'd been watching the room as much as listening to it. She thought about Betsy sitting across from her in the break room 40 minutes ago, hands flat on the table, telling her that every person on the floor was going to tell the same story. There was only one story to tell. That part had been true, at least. The story was the same. It had just had a different character in it than Mara had known. "Is there anything else I need to know right now?" she said. Okafor considered the question. "Marcia's formal charges are being filed this afternoon. Federal, conspiracy, obstruction, aiding and abetting an attempt on a protected federal witness. The contractor network is under simultaneous investigation in 3 jurisdictions. We expect additional arrests in the next 72 hours. She paused. "Your name is in the federal record as a cooperating witness and a material participant in the protection of Raymond Volk. When the case goes public, and it will go public, your role last night will be part of that record." Mara looked at the window at the end of the records corridor. Morning light, gray and flat. The kind of November morning in Oregon that never quite decides whether to be overcast or clear. "Okay," she said. She went back downstairs. She went to Jerome Fleck's room first. The cardiac ICU was quieter than the surgical ICU, a different register of beeping, a different population of patients, a different texture of crisis managed to stable. Fleck was in room 4, sitting up at about 30 degrees, attached to a cardiac monitor and a single IV line, looking considerably more present than he had the last time she'd seen him. His wife, a small woman in her late 50s named Carol, was in the chair beside the bed. She stood up when Mara came through the door, and for a moment she just looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has been trying to formulate something for hours and has discovered that no formulation is adequate. She crossed the room and took Mara's hands in both of hers and held them. She didn't say anything. Mara didn't either. After a moment, Carol said, "The doctor told us what the imaging showed. What would have happened?" She stopped. Her hands tightened slightly. I don't have words for—" "You don't need them," Mara said. Fleck was watching from the bed with the alert, careful expression of a man who has recently been made aware of how close he came to not being in any room at all. "They told me you were fired for doing it," he said. "Temporarily," she said. "That's not right." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He looked at her for a moment with the directness of someone who doesn't have the energy for anything except the real thing. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, plain, no architecture around them. "You're welcome," she said, equally plain. She stayed for 4 minutes. She checked his chart at the door on the way out. Cardiologist's notes, medication adjustments, a plan for stress testing in 72 hours that was appropriately conservative. Good care. She put the chart back and went back to the elevator. In the elevator, she stood with her eyes closed for 30 seconds and let herself be tired, not the functional tiredness she'd been managing for hours, the kind you push through by staying in motion, the real thing, the weight behind it, the accumulated cost of a night that had asked for more than most nights did. She let it sit there. Then the elevator opened, and she went back to work. The afternoon brought the kind of institutional activity that follows a federal investigation the way weather follows a pressure system, inevitable, structural, affecting everything in its path regardless of what anyone in the building had planned to do with their Tuesday. FBI agents worked the 4th-floor records room in rotating shifts. The hospital's legal counsel held continuous consultation sessions in the 2nd-floor conference room. The communications director issued 3 separate statements before noon, each one more specific than the last, as the scope of what had happened became harder to manage with vague language. The security footage was the thing that broke the containment. Okafor's office hadn't released it. It was evidentiary, under federal seal, but someone in the building had captured the ER on a personal phone the night before, the moment Mara had walked back through the entrance with Farrow. And that footage, 12 seconds of low-quality video showing a nurse who'd been escorted out 40 minutes earlier walking back in with what were clearly federal operators at her side, had been shared and then shared again. And by 2 in the afternoon, it had the specific momentum of a thing that wasn't stopping. The hospital's communications director came to find Mara at 2:15. She was in Bay 7 with a patient, a 16-year-old with an asthma exacerbation bad enough to need nebulizers and observation, but not bad enough to need the ICU, which was a good outcome, and she was managing it quietly. And the communications director stood outside the bay with the look of someone who needed something immediately and understood that they were going to have to wait. She finished with the patient. She stepped into the corridor. "The board wants to make a statement that includes your name," the director said. He was a trim man in his 40s named Paul Greer, and he had the particular energy of someone whose entire professional skill set was currently insufficient to the situation he was managing. "With your permission." "What does the statement say?" He handed her his phone. She read it. It was accurate. It was also carefully written to serve the institution as much as it served the record. The language balanced in a way that foregrounded the hospital's commitment to patient safety while threading her role through it in a way that was visible but not central. She understood why it was written that way. She also understood that it wasn't quite right. "Change one thing," she said. She handed the phone back. The line that says Dr. Marsh's termination reflects the hospital's zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. Take that out. Greer looked at her. "Why?" "Because it implies the institution caught it. The institution didn't catch it. A patient almost died because the institution didn't catch it, and then federal investigators caught it after the fact." She held his eyes. "Say what's accurate. That the hospital is cooperating fully with the federal investigation and that a review of all clinical decisions under Marsh's authority is underway. That's true, and it's more honest than the other version." Greer looked at the phone, looked at her. "The board may push back." "Tell them I said so," she said, and went back to the patient in Bay 7. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Des Farrow found her in the break room. She'd been in the building for 19 hours at that point, had slept 0 of them, and was on her 4th cup of coffee, which she knew was a bad idea and had stopped caring about 2 cups ago. She was looking at nothing in particular. The break room wall, the bulletin board with its cluster of shift reminders, and a birthday card for someone named Tompkins that was a month past the date, when Farrow came in and sat down across from her. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, slightly at a loss for the next thing to say. He sat with that for a moment. "Volk's asking for you again," he said finally. "I heard. He's been extubated for 11 hours. His vitals are good. Rain says another 12 hours, and he's ready to be transferred to the Federal Protective Facility." He folded his hands on the table. "He said he won't go until he talks to you." She looked at her coffee. "That's not a reasonable position for someone in his situation." "No, he knows that. He's taking it anyway." Farrow paused. "He's not always reasonable. He's been around long enough to decide what he'll hold out for." She put down the cup. She stood. The shoulder protested the movement, and she ignored it, which was a conversation she'd been having with it for 12 hours, with no sign either side was going to yield. 15 minutes, she said. "That's all he needs," Farrow said. Volk was sitting up in the ICU bed at about 45 degrees, which was a significant change from the horizontal, intubated version of him that she'd been managing for the last 10 hours. He was still connected to the cardiac monitor and had a nasal cannula running supplemental oxygen at 2 liters, but the lines were reduced to 2 and the ventilator was gone, and the difference in the room was substantial. He looked at her when she came in with the direct, appraising attention she'd noticed in the trauma bay. The quality of someone who had spent years assessing people quickly because the alternative was expensive. "You're the one who put the chest tube in," he said. His voice was rough, the texture of someone who'd had a tube down their throat and was still negotiating the aftermath. "Yes. And the thing before that, in the ambulance bay. Needle decompression, you had a tension pneumothorax developing." "I know what it was. I read the chart." He looked at her steadily. "The surgeon told me the abdominal fragment missed the hepatic vein by about 4 millimeters. That's accurate?" "She also told me that the decision to go to surgery when she did, the way the pre-op stabilization was managed, she said that bought the margin." He paused. "That was you." She said nothing. "I've been around military medicine long enough to know what I'm looking at," he said. "You didn't learn what you did last night in a hospital ER." She looked at the window. The afternoon light had shifted, less gray, a thin stripe of actual sun coming through the cloud layer, the kind of light that shows up in Oregon in November, like it's apologizing for something. "No," she said. "I didn't." "How long?" 12 years. He was quiet for a moment. Why the civilian nursing? It was the question she'd answered for herself 100 times in different ways. And none of the answers were completely wrong, and none of them were completely sufficient either. She thought about what version to give him, and decided on the honest one because he'd earned it. "I was ready to do the same work in quieter circumstances," she said. "I thought quieter would be easier." "Was it?" "It was different." She looked at him. Last night was not quieter. Something moved in his face that was close to a smile. "No." He looked at his hands, the IV still taped to the left one, the surgical scrubs, the hospital bracelet. "I've been sitting here for the last 3 hours thinking about the timing of what happened last night. They hit the convoy 4 minutes after the route was called. The ambush was set up before we left the staging point." He looked up. "Someone in the federal structure sold us out. The investigation knows." The investigation. He said it in a way that contained a lot of information about what he thought of that. "The contractor network I'm testifying against has been running for 9 years. 3 prior witnesses either recanted or disappeared before trial. The case that's coming in 3 days is the first time the government has enough physical documentation to proceed without relying solely on testimony." He paused. "Which is why they needed me dead before Thursday." She looked at him. "I'm still here," he said, "because of what you did last night. Not the investigation, not the protective detail. You." He held her eyes. "I need you to understand that I understand that." She stood with it for a moment. The thing about gratitude at that scale was that it had a weight you didn't know what to do with. It wasn't comfortable. It was real, and it was earned, and it didn't change anything she'd done or why she'd done it, and she didn't know how to hold it except to let it be there without deflecting it. "Testify," she said. "That's what I need from you." "I intend to." "Then we're square," she said. She left him to rest. Elliot Marsh was formally charged at 5:15 that afternoon. The charges were filed in federal court in Portland. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, aiding and abetting an attempt on a protected federal witness, and 1 count of criminal facilitation related to the unlawful termination of a hospital employee for the purpose of enabling a criminal enterprise. The last charge had been added that morning based on the communication records from his phone. Specifically, the message thread that confirmed the termination had been coordinated with outside parties in advance. Mara learned about the charges from a text from Okafor's office at 5:22. She read it in the supply corridor outside the ER, where she'd gone to restock a cart, and she stood with the phone in her hand for a long moment. Criminal facilitation. Her termination was a federal charge. She put the phone in her pocket and finished restocking the cart. Betsy Orville was charged an hour later. Federal conspiracy, obstruction, and a charge related to the access facilitation of the loading dock entry used in the incursion. She was processed and transported to the federal detention facility in Portland without incident, which was exactly what Okafor had said she'd predicted. Because Betsy Orville was not a person who made scenes. The hospital was notified. The floor was notified. The nursing staff found out the way nursing staffs find out things. Through the specific velocity of information that moves through a closed professional community, person to person, in the compressed shorthand of people who don't have time for the long version but need the facts. Curtis, the young nurse who'd been at the station when the monitors went dark the night before, found Mara near the medication room at 6 in the evening. He looked like he'd been struggling with something for a while. "Betsy," he said. "I know," she said. "She was—" He stopped, started again. "She was the one who told me to start nursing 2 years ago. I was thinking about switching programs. She sat down with me for 45 minutes on her break and told me why I should stay." He looked at the wall. "I don't know what to do with that." Mara thought about what to say. She thought about the granola bar and the coffee, and the way Betsy had held her hands flat on the break room table and said there was only one story to tell. "You hold both things," she said. She was that person, and she was also this person. People aren't one or the other. You hold both and you don't let either one cancel the other out. She paused. "It doesn't get less complicated. You just get better at carrying complicated things." He looked at her. "Is that what you do?" She thought about 12 years of carrying things that didn't simplify. I'm working on it, she said. He nodded slowly, the same way Cullen had nodded the night before. The nod that meant something was going somewhere, rather than just being acknowledged. He went back to the floor. Putty. At 7 in the evening, Des Farrow came to the ER with the man Mara hadn't met. He was in his late 50s, compact and weathered, with close-cut silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades with weight on their shoulders and had built the musculature to carry it. He wore civilian clothes, khakis, a dark jacket, but wore them the way people wear civilian clothes when the clothes are a choice rather than a habit. Farrow introduced him as Commander Dale Pritchard, retired. Special Operations Command, 12 years active before transitioning to oversight roles with Federal Defense Contracting Review Boards, the same defense contracting ecosystem that was now at the center of a federal indictment. Pritchard looked at Mara with the evaluating attention of someone who had been told something specific and was verifying it against the person in front of him. Chief Warrant Farrow speaks very highly of you, he said. Farrow is generous, she said. He's precise, Pritchard said. He doesn't do generous. He looked at the department around them, the board, the bays, the staff moving through the evening shift with the particular focused energy of people doing difficult work in difficult conditions and doing it well. You spent 12 years as lead combat medic for a SEAL task force and then came here. Yes. Why here, specifically? She thought about the question. She'd answered versions of it to Volk an hour ago, and to herself several hundred times over 3 years, and to no one in the middle of a lot of nights she'd rather not enumerate. My sister lives in Dunmore, she said. It was the simplest true answer. Something in Pritchard's face shifted. A brief adjustment, the recalibration of someone who'd been expecting a more constructed response. How much of your service record is accessible to you? Most of it was classified when I separated. I don't know what's been declassified since. Some of it has been, he said. The commendation from the Kandahar extraction was declassified 18 months ago. The field surgical record from the Tora Bora follow-on is still restricted. He paused. I've read both. She looked at him. I'm on the oversight board for the DoD's Combat Casualty Care Modernization Initiative, he said. We've been looking for someone to lead the civilian-military medical integration component for 2 years. Someone who's worked both sides of that divide at a level of operational depth that most people haven't. He held her eyes. We've been looking for someone like you specifically. We just didn't know you were here. She stood with that. The department moved around her. A gurney going past, a phone ringing at the nursing station, the overhead page calling a physician to the second floor. I have a job, she said. I know. I'm not asking you to leave it. He reached into his jacket and took out a card. Plain, federal, just a name and a number. I'm asking you to think about doing more than one thing at a time. He held the card out. The program is attached to 3 trauma centers in the Pacific Northwest. Training protocols, real-time response frameworks, civilian-military coordination in mass casualty scenarios. The kind of infrastructure that means the next time something like last night happens in a hospital somewhere, the staff knows what to do. She looked at the card. She thought about Cullen in the break room last night, asking what to do with what he'd seen. She thought about Ames standing behind Volk's bed with his hand on the ventilator circuit, doing the one job he'd been given with everything he had. She thought about the 16-year-old with the asthma exacerbation that afternoon, and the woman with the dislocated shoulder sitting on the break room floor holding Dara's hand, and Jerome Fleck's wife on the phone crying for 3 minutes while Betsy held the line open. She thought about Betsy. She took the card. I'll think about it, she said. Pritchard nodded, not with satisfaction, with respect, which was a different thing. He left without further pressure, which told her something about him that the card and the title didn't. Farrow stayed. He stood next to her in the corridor, and they watched Pritchard leave through the main entrance, and they were quiet for a moment in the way of people who have been through something together and don't need to characterize it immediately. You could have told me, she said. About Pritchard? About any of it. If you knew enough to find me in a parking lot at 11:30 at night, you knew more than you said. He was quiet for a moment. We knew Volk's convoy route had been compromised. We didn't know the hospital was part of it until we were already in it. He paused. I knew your file. I knew what you were capable of. I didn't know about Marsh or Orville until the communication records. Another pause. I also didn't know you'd been fired 20 minutes before I called you. Would it have changed what you said? He thought about it honestly. No. Then it doesn't matter. He looked at her sideways. You're not angry. She thought about it. I'm tired, she said. There's a difference. He almost smiled. Almost. Weaver's flying in Thursday, he said. He wanted me to tell you. He could text me himself. He said you'd say that. He said to tell you he wanted me to say it in person so you'd actually process it instead of responding immediately and then forgetting. She looked at the ceiling briefly. That's annoyingly accurate. Yeah, Pharaoh said. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. Get some sleep, Mara. He left. The hospital was quieter at 9 in the evening than it had been at any point in the last 22 hours, which was a low bar but still qualified as quiet. The board was lighter. The night shift had come on and the day staff had mostly gone home, and the department had the particular quality of a place that has absorbed something large and is in the process of settling back into its own shape. Changed, not restored. The shape different from before, even if the outline looks similar. Mara finished her notes at 9:15. She sat at the nursing station and looked at the board and looked at the night around her and thought about 3 years of being quiet in this building. 3 years of compressing herself into the smallest professional footprint she could manage, of moving carefully, of having opinions she didn't voice, and making calls that she timed to look like luck or reflex rather than knowledge. 3 years of watching physicians make decisions she could have improved on and saying nothing, of filing what she knew in the back of the room and leaving it there, because the cost of bringing it forward was a cost she'd decided she wasn't paying again. She hadn't been hiding from the work. She'd been hiding from the exposure. And there was a version of that decision that was self-protective and reasonable, and there was a version of it that was something else, a kind of quiet defeat masquerading as discipline, a woman who had once been trusted with everything learning to ask permission for small things, not because she believed the small things required permission, but because permission had started to feel like proof that she was allowed to be here at all. Jerome Fleck had needed her to stop asking for permission. Raymond Volk had needed her to stop asking for permission. The 16-year-old with the asthma exacerbation and the woman on the break room floor and every patient who had come through this department in 3 years had needed her to be fully in the room rather than half in it with one eye on the door. She'd known that, somewhere in the back of the room where she kept things. She hadn't wanted to pay what knowing it cost. Last night had made the decision for her, which was the thing about situations that reach a certain threshold of urgency. They take the calculation out of your hands and leave you with only the choice of what to do with what you know, right now, with the resources in front of you. She'd made that choice. It had cost her things she was still adding up and would probably keep adding up for a while. It had also saved lives, changed the trajectory of a federal case, and put 2 people in federal custody who had been operating inside a hospital that trusted them. It had shown Cullen something he was going to carry into every clinical decision for the rest of his career. It had shown Ames what it looked like to hold position when everything around you was asking you to move. She didn't know if that was enough to call it worth it. She wasn't sure worth it was the right framework for nights like last night. She thought it was the right thing. That was different from worth it, and it was what she had. She closed her notes. The board convened a formal session on Friday, 3 days after the night that Dunmore, Oregon's local news, had taken to calling, with characteristic understatement, the incident at Hargrove Regional. The full board, the interim administrator, legal counsel, and 2 representatives from the State Medical Licensing Authority attended. The session ran for 4 hours. The outcomes were made public in a statement released at 6 in the evening. Dr. Elliot Marsh's medical license had been referred to the State Licensing Board for emergency suspension pending the criminal proceedings. The referral included documentation of 19 specific clinical decisions during his tenure as trauma director that the review committee had flagged for further investigation, 4 of which involved patient outcomes that the committee described as requiring immediate audit. The criminal charges, federal, not state, were proceeding on the schedule Okafor's office had outlined. Betsy Orville's nursing license was similarly referred for suspension. Her federal charges were in the same proceeding as Marsh's, and the prosecutor's office had indicated that cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the contractor network was being offered as a factor in sentencing consideration. Whether she'd take it was her decision to make. The hospital's statement included a formal written apology, not the institutional kind with passive voice language and careful distance, but a direct acknowledgement, 5 paragraphs, addressed specifically to Mara Voss by name, signed by every member of the board, that said in plain language that her termination had been wrongful, that it had been engineered by a member of the hospital's leadership in service of criminal interests, and that the institution bore responsibility for the environment that made it possible. It also said that a review was underway into clinical oversight structures across all departments, and that an independent patient safety committee would be established with authority to flag and escalate concerns outside the departmental hierarchy, a structural change that meant no single administrator could again sit between a clinical concern and the people responsible for addressing it. Mara read the statement on her phone standing in the hospital parking lot on Friday evening, in approximately the same spot she'd been standing 22 minutes after being fired on Tuesday night. She read it twice. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, which was some version of vindication, the clean, resolved sensation of a thing finally corrected. What she felt was more textured than that. Something like relief, and something like grief for the version of this institution she'd believed in before the week had made it more complicated, and something like the specific weight of knowing that the statement, accurate as it was, didn't reach back and change the night it was describing. It could say what had happened was wrong. It couldn't undo what had happened being necessary. She put the phone in her pocket. The parking lot was cold and damp and lit in the orange wash of the overhead lamps, and her car was at the far end of the lot, with the cracked side mirror she kept meaning to fix. She hadn't fixed it. She'd been busy. Raymond Volk testified before the federal grand jury on Thursday, 31 hours after leaving the surgical ICU at Hargrove Regional in a federal transport vehicle under a security detail that was, this time, 4 layers deep and coordinated directly with Okafor's office rather than through a communication channel that had been compromised. He testified for 6 hours. Mara didn't follow the proceedings in real time. She was on shift. But Farrow sent her a text at 2 p.m. that said, "He finished. Grand jury is in deliberations. Prosecution expects indictment by end of week." She read it between patients and sent back, "Good." The indictment came down on Friday at noon, 14 counts across 7 defendants, including 3 executives of the defense contractor under investigation, 2 federal employees who had provided access to the convoy route and communications channel, and the private security contractor who'd been running the operation from the parking lot of Hargrove Regional while armed men moved through the building above him. The indictment named Elliot Marsh and Betsy Orville as co-conspirators in the obstruction component. When the news crossed the hospital's staff messaging system that afternoon, the ER went briefly, collectively still in the way places do when something that has been unresolved finally resolves. A held breath released, a weight set down, the room exhaling. Then someone's monitor alarmed in Bay 3, and they went back to work. But on Saturday morning, Des Farrow came to Hargrove Regional for the last time. He came with Thomas Weaver, who had flown in from Joint Base Lewis McChord, and who was standing in the lobby when Mara came off the elevator at 8 a.m, looking like a man who hadn't slept on the plane and had eaten whatever the airport offered and considered both of those acceptable trade-offs for getting here faster. He looked at her for a moment. "You look terrible," he said. "You look the same," she said. He laughed, the short, genuine kind that came from a real place rather than a social one. He'd always laughed that way, even in places where laughing had required ignoring everything around you, and the sound of it was something she hadn't realized she'd been carrying as a memory until it was in the room with her and she could put it down. She shook his hand and he turned it into a brief hug, and she let him, because some things were beyond the reach of whatever professional composure she was technically maintaining. Pritchard was there too, and Commander Dale Pritchard, Mara would learn over the following weeks, was not a man who made ceremonial gestures for their own sake. He was there because he had something to give, and he had brought the paperwork with him. And the paperwork was something that had been classified and then declassified and then lost in an administrative gap between her separation from the military and the moment she'd walked into Hargrove Regional 3 years ago and started being Mara Voss, night shift nurse. Unremarkable. The commendation from the Kandahar extraction, the field surgical record, and attached to them, A letter from the commanding officer of the task force she'd served with, written 14 months ago when the declassification was processed and sent to an address she'd moved away from and never received. The letter said, among other things, that Petty Officer First Class Mara Voss had demonstrated exceptional medical judgment and personal courage under sustained enemy fire during a 6-hour casualty management period that resulted in the survival of 11 service members who would not otherwise have survived. It said that her service had been of a caliber that the unit considered exemplary by any standard in any context. It said that the commendation she was receiving was overdue by the length of the classification period and that the oversight was regretted. Farrow read a portion of it aloud, standing in the lobby of Hargrove Regional Medical Center, and he did not do it with ceremony or performance. He did it the way Farrow did everything, flatly, precisely, with the words carrying what the words carried and nothing extra laid on top. The lobby was not empty. It was a Saturday morning. There were family members waiting, a few staff passing through, the registration desk running its normal operations. They stopped and listened without being asked to, the way people stop for things that have a certain quality of realness. When Farrow finished, nobody applauded. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, and quieter was right. Weaver said, "Overdue doesn't cover it." Mara held the letter in both hands. The paper was official stock, government weight, slightly stiff. She looked at it, at her name on it, at the specificity of the language, at the date of the letter versus the date she was reading it. 14 months. 14 months, this had been sitting in a system she'd exited, addressed to a version of her life she'd packed up and moved away from, and she'd been here the whole time being told, in small and large ways, that she was slow and unremarkable and didn't have the temperament for the work. She felt the irony of it and felt the grief of it and felt something else underneath both of those, something that wasn't quite peace but was adjacent to it, the particular quality of a thing being named after a long time of going unnamed. She folded the letter carefully. "Thank you," she said to Farrow, and to Pritchard, and to Weaver, who hadn't done the reading but had flown here to be present for it, which was its own kind of language. Gerald Trout, the board chair, was there. She hadn't noticed him until he stepped forward, slightly awkward, in the way of a man who is used to being the institutional voice and is currently feeling the limits of what institutions can adequately say. He extended his hand. "On behalf of this hospital," he said, formally, and with the full understanding of what that word means after this week, "we're glad you're here." She shook his hand. She thought about what she wanted to say and found that what she wanted to say was simple enough that she trusted it. "Take care of your patients," she said. "All of the ways that means." He nodded. He understood. At 9:15 that morning, Mara Voss walked back through the emergency department of Hargrove Regional Medical Center and went to work. She picked up the board. She reviewed the overnight cases. She checked in with the night nurse handing off, asked 2 questions, noted one thing that needed follow-up, and filed it. She went to Bay 2, where a woman in her 60s was waiting for a respiratory assessment, and introduced herself and started the intake and listened. Actually listened. The way she'd always listened, with the full weight of everything she knew brought to bear on the person in front of her. Nothing compressed, nothing held back, nothing performing less than what it was. The woman looked at her when she finished the exam and said, "You really pay attention." "It matters," Mara said. The woman looked at her for a moment with the specific directness of someone who has spent the night in a waiting room being shuffled past and is surprised to feel seen. "Yes," she said, "it does." Mara made her notes and moved to the next patient, and the next, and the next, and the department moved around her with its familiar rhythms, and the board updated, and the monitors beeped, and the sliding glass doors opened and closed as they always had and always would, bringing in whoever needed to be brought in, and she was there. She was there, and she was not quiet anymore in the way she'd been quiet. The compressed, careful quiet of someone rationing themselves, saving the most of what they were for circumstances that would justify the expenditure. That version of quiet was gone. What remained was something else. Something that looked from the outside to people who hadn't known her before. Like steadiness, like competence, like a woman who moved through difficult situations with a particular kind of grounded calm that made the people around her feel, without being able to say exactly why, that the situation was manageable. People who had known her before, Cullen, who watched her from across the department with the look of someone recalibrating everything he thought he'd understood about the last 3 years. Curtis, who'd made it through the worst night of his short career and come back on Saturday morning because quitting hadn't occurred to him. Dr. Rains, who'd passed through the ER on rounds and stopped to say something brief and direct that ended with, "Call me Adrienne," would have said she looked the same. She looked exactly the same. That was the thing nobody had understood, and some of them were starting to. She had always been this. The work had always been this. The quiet hadn't been absence, it had been discipline, the trained capacity to do the most important things without requiring anyone to see them done. She'd built that quality over 12 years in places that demanded it, and it had followed her here. And for 3 years it had been read as limitation by people whose framework for reading it was too small to hold what it actually was. Some of them knew that now. Some of them would carry it forward into how they saw the nurses around them, the quiet ones, the methodical ones, the ones who arrived 7 minutes early and ate lunch in 12 and went back to work without fanfare. Some of them would look at those people differently and ask different questions and listen more carefully to the answers. That mattered more to her in the long run than the commendation or the board's apology or the federal record or the look on Marcia's face when the agents came for him. The work was what mattered. The work and the people it went toward, and the decision every single shift to bring all of yourself to that. Not the version of yourself that fits the room's expectations, not the version that's been approved and credentialed and made comfortable to those above you in the hierarchy, but the actual version, the full one, the one that knows what it knows and does not apologize for knowing it. That was the thing she'd let herself forget, somewhere in the careful business of being invisible. And last night, the night that had started with being escorted out a door and ended with 11 people whose lives had gone differently because she'd come back through it, had reminded her. You don't get to save anyone by making yourself smaller than what you are. You don't get to do the most important work from the back of the room with your hands in your pockets. The patients in front of you deserve the real version, the full version, the one that doesn't wait for permission to know what it knows. And whoever told you that version was too much. Whoever stood at the door of the space you were meant to occupy and said you don't belong here, you don't have the temperament, you don't have the standing. They were wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they see what they expect to see instead of what's actually there. The truth doesn't need their permission to be true. It just needs you to keep showing up. Mara Voss kept showing up. She always had. For every person who has ever been the quietest one in the room, not because they had nothing to say, but because the room hadn't learned to listen yet. Keep going. The work is the proof. The work has always been the proof.